Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known facts behind your favorite music, movies, TV shows, and more. We are your icebergs of intel, here to sink your ship of apathy into a sea of sensationalized details. My name is Jordan Runtagh.
And I'm Alex Heigl. I can't believe you just came up with that in 30 seconds.
I mean, we're working on this episode for 6 weeks now, so you know what? I guess it's been marinating. It's been marinating.
Yeah.
Well, folks, today we are bringing you the third and final installment in our epic trilogy exploring the making of James Cameron's Titanic, which turned 25 years old a few weeks back. The last episode explored what was basically the first VHS of the original 2-tape release. In other words, all the happy romantic stuff. The King of the World scene, the Draw Me Like One of Your French Girls scene, the scene where Jack wins over the snobs at the first-class dinner party, the raucous Irish dance party in third class, and, of course, car sex. All in all, a good time. This episode is a bad time. We'll explore all the stuff that went down in the second VHS. That's when all hell breaks loose. The ship starts to sink and the movie goes from being a period romance to being basically a high-octane action movie. I have to admit, as a little boy, I sometimes went straight to tape 2. Did you do that too? It was basically one of the most heteronormative things I ever did.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best part. My indelible image of this movie is not the car sex, but the God's Eye shot.
Yeah, with the guy on the propeller.
Yep.
Yeah.
Says a lot about us.
Every woman in my life says, yeah, you know what? First tape was the one that I always watched first and preferred. Every guy in my life, you know what? I hate it. I sound like a lame 90s
clapping
stand-up.
like a barking seal and being like, big ship sink.
I know. I feel, I always feel like, I say this about many things in my life. I feel in many ways like Bill Paxton's character in this movie, where at the beginning, he's just all about kind of like the treasure and the sensationalism of it. And then by the end of the movie, he learns the heart of the story. And that's kind of was my relationship with Titanic. Like as a little kid, I was interested in the archaeology of it. And in a way, I don't know, in the same way that kids are into like dinosaurs and trucks, it was a big thing. You know what? I was like 5, 6 years old when I got into the Titanic, long before the movie came out. And it was just hit some kind of like primal child thing in me. And then I used to watch all these documentaries and this movie all the time. And then I started revisiting them in the last couple of years, like as someone in their early mid-30s. And now it's like, whoa. I will choke up at certain points during this episode when we talk about, the old man not being allowed a spot on the lifeboat and his wife stays behind to be with him. Things like that just hit totally differently when you have some life under your belt. Good Lord. So this is our first and probably only, let's face it, 3-parter that we're ever going to tackle on here. I'm very much aware that Titanic is very much my thing as opposed to yours. How are you holding up? Has this changed your view of Titanic, the film, or the historical event in any way?
Really what it's done for me is I have to hand it to James Cameron, man. I'm still not going to watch Avatar.
No.
But it is really mind-boggling. And I knew some of it, but it really just... the mind fairly reels, I'm not sure, aside from Avatar, like what else would really compare in terms of doing this kind of work for a movie. I mean, like at a certain point, it really becomes like, yeah, this is just a movie, right, bud? And it was not. It was not for James Cameron. It wasn't.
No, I mean, we'll get into a lot more of those kind of stories in this episode, but this was like Apocalypse Now, like not like making the movie, but the actual experience of being in the jungle for James Cameron.
I think, we talked about this a little in part 1 about how like Cameron doesn't really have like the fervent stan base that like, your PTAs or your Wes Andersons do, but I think he's shaped modern filmmaking more than anyone except for like Spielberg in terms of just like not shaping like, again, camera techniques or whatever, but just really redefining the scope of what these big pop culture tent pieces can do, because he's not making like, ambitious single take avant-garde filmmaking. No one's saying he's like Godard or Kurosawa, people I have claimed to have watched but never actually have. He is literally affecting the landscape of 21st century filmmaking. So,
well, before we go any further, I would like to shout out some younger history buffs that I think are carrying on in the spirit of James Cameron's insane completist streak and obsessive attention to detail. Historians are usually seen as these older, slightly tweedy people, but this team is in their 20s, and they're attempting to digitally recreate the Titanic in its entirety through painstaking research. This project is called Honor and Glory, so named for the figures that adorn the clock in the grand staircase. And the idea is that you can travel through the entire ship. It's completely interactive. Every door, every drawer, every item you see, you can interact with. And these people are the real deal. They've been working with the greatest Titanic historians who've been on the case for like 50 plus years, trying to get the correct coat hangers or the correct color of a material in a room where all we have are black and white photos, or the correct design for a room where there are no photos. It's really nuts. And they've been working on this project since 2012, and they're still not done yet. So they've beaten James Cameron for the endurance test portion of this. But the demo versions that are available for free on their website and the walkthroughs on their YouTube channel are just phenomenal. I think they also have VR Oculus capability too. It's so wild. And obviously I'm a giant nerd, so of course I think what they're doing is extremely cool, but it gets me excited in general about a younger generation of historians who can basically harness the power of the internet and use it as the incredible database that it is. I mean, in the same way that you've got kids that are half my age who have been exposed to 10 times more music than I ever have because of growing up with Spotify. I think it's the same deal with young historians and research. They can do more research in a decade than some people do in their whole lives. And then they can build on it from there and take what we know about moments in history even further. So if you're coming back to listen to us for even more Titanic minutia, I think you might enjoy these folks too. Their website's Honor and Glory, and they're on YouTube as well. And they have another YouTube channel called Titanic University, where they have a wealth of cool granular videos that I love. Like it's like a 15-minute long one about how they heated the Titanic.
That's definitely better SEO. Honor and Glory feels like it's going to take me to like a white pride site.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. See, for me as a Titanic buff, I knew exactly what that meant, but I'm sure out of context, you're right. That seems like a D.W. Griffith film. Yeah.
Which would be the next thing James Cameron remakes. Avatar, Birth of a Nation.
They're on Patreon as well, I should say, if you want to kick them a couple bucks. Anyhow, without further ado, let's get into it. We'll get into the truly insane stories behind James Cameron's sinking of the Titanic, or should I say repeated sinkings, an experience that very nearly killed Kate Winslet many times over and cost the sanity of the crew. We'll also get into the true life stories of heroism on the real Titanic, bust some myths about the lifeboats, and tackle the most enduring controversy associated with the Titanic production. Could Jack have fit on that floating piece of wood paneling alongside Rose?
It's not a door.
It's not a door. So quit saying it's a door. It's a piece of door paneling. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the third and final part of our trilogy, sharing everything you didn't know about James Cameron's Titanic. I'd like to begin this episode by telling you a fictional story about another ship that sank in the North Atlantic. This British ship struck an iceberg on her starboard or right side during the month of April and sank roughly 400 miles up the coast of Newfoundland, all of which was the case for Titanic. There was a tremendous death toll due to the fact that there weren't enough lifeboats aboard for all passengers. This ship was roughly the same gargantuan size as the Titanic and traveled at a similar speed, and even boasted similar safety features that were supposed to have rendered her indestructible and, dare I say, even unsinkable. The ship's name was the Titan. Now, you're probably thinking that this fictional story is the work of a lazy author who just cribbed the Titanic story for their own work, but this is where it gets really weird. This story was published in 1898, 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic. It's taken from a novella called Futility, The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson. And after the Titanic disaster, many accused Robertson of having clairvoyant black magic powers. He denied this, saying instead that he was simply very knowledgeable about shipbuilding trends, thanks to family members who worked on luxury liners. But still, there are 41.1 million square miles of Atlantic Ocean, and he chose roughly the same spot where the Titanic went down. And, there are many reasons why a ship could sink besides an iceberg. But this ship struck an iceberg, and then there's the name, Titan, Titanic. Kind of makes you think fate preordained? I don't know. Robertson also claims to invented the periscope, which I just wanted to include because that sounds like something Dr. Evil would say during that speech describing his father. My father would make outrageous claims like he invented the periscope. Anyway.
What a great coda to that.
Yeah. Well, now let us move from the spooky to the terrifying.
The sinking scenes in Titanic were the most challenging scenes to capture. It was not only technically complex, but also the most hazardous for the crew. During these moments, James Cameron transformed into the worst version of himself. And this is a man who almost killed someone already in the water on the set of The Abyss.
For legal reasons.
For legal reasons, we have to say James Cameron almost killed many people. This is so bizarre to me. They had a nickname for him when he turned into the bad Jim. Midge or Mij. I don't know. It's Jim spelled backwards, like evil Spock, like with the goatee. It's ridiculous. A profile in the New York Times offered this memorable description of Midge. Cameron became known as an uncompromising, hard-charging perfectionist and 300 decibel screamer, a modern-day Captain Bligh with a megaphone and walkie-talkie, swooping down into people's faces on a 162-foot crane. That's
a great image. I love that.
Realistically, Jim it probably brought up his blood pressure. James Cameron was probably in a apoplectic rage for like 90% of the shoot. Not only did he yell at people all the time, he maybe got a little physical with a couple crew members. There was 80-hour, 6-day work weeks. One crew member described the environment as the closest thing to slavery I've ever laid my eyes on. Which is our second dubious reference to slavery in this trilogy. Some of the crew claimed that they worked upwards of 10 consecutive hours without a break. Some actors got kidney infections after being submerged in the pool for so long. Members of the crew have also talked about working 13 days straight before Christmas, to the point where these stunt workers were actually falling asleep. They were falling asleep during their safety briefings to go over the scene where the grand staircase is flooded. You don't want to be falling asleep during that particular safety briefing. Cameron's longtime editor Mark Goldblatt said of him, "You don't just join one of his films, you sign on for a tour of duty." Cameron echoed the sentiment, saying, "Filmmaking is a war, a great battle between business and aesthetics." Cameron took to wearing a t-shirt with a slogan that seemed to justify this punishing schedule. "Time means nothing in the face of creativity." Sounds like a line of some of his dialogue. The crew countered by having t-shirts made, which had some of their favorite on-set quotes from Jim or his associates. "Jim's a hands-on director, and I have the bruises to prove it. No animals were hurt during the making of this film, but the actors were tossed around like styrofoam cups. Don't get creative. I hate that. Waiting on lipstick? I say we just tattoo their lips. It's a timing thing. I don't care if it has any organic emotional reality or not."
That was my favorite.
That's a good one. "You either shoot it my way or you do another f***ing movie."
Bill Paxton, who it should be noted was a dear friend of James Cameron's, admitted there were a lot of disgruntled people on the set. Jim is not one of those guys who has the time to win hearts and minds, which is probably why someone spiked his chowder with PCP. James Cameron yelled so much that script supervisor Shelley Crawford was quoted as telling Premiere Magazine, "I can't even tell the difference between yelling and not yelling anymore. It's just, what does he want and what do we have to do to get it done?" The reporter for Premiere, John H. Richardson, who called his piece "Inside the Punishing Dictatorship That Was James Cameron's Titanic Set," observed an incident where a cable stopped working. He said, "Cameron yelps, 'All right, this is major.' He turns to an actor. 'Can I have your gun, please?' The actor hands over a stunt gun. Jim points it at the cable tech. 'Which kneecap do you want it in?' he asks." Granted, James Cameron was joking, but this was in front of a reporter, which just gives you some idea of what it was like when press weren't around. His behavior admittedly improved when reporters were present, which led the crew to joke, or, joke in quotes, about hiring an extra and having them around at all times and just telling James Cameron that it was a reporter. My personal favorite Midge moment occurred when Cameron invited one of the preeminent Titanic historians, a guy by the name of Don Lynch, to serve as a historical consultant on the set. And during the chaotic sinking scenes where one of the lifeboats is nearly lowered onto another boat that's already in the water, it's like, really scary. It's threatening to crush the people that are inside in the lower one. That really happened, but the historian gets on his walkie-talkie and very politely tells James Cameron, hey, that wasn't how it happened. The lifeboat wasn't that close to crushing people in the water. The people in the lower boat, they could stand up and touch the hull of the boat, but not much lower than that. Cameron just dismissively snaps, "Thanks for your opinion. Now I'm going to make it exciting." This is to one of the world's leading Titanic historians. And James Cameron's like, "Nerd."
Nerd alert. And yet, in spite of themselves,
And yet, I've grown
Yeah.
accustomed to the sound of his shrieking in my ear.
People found themselves, fond of him, not just limited to Bill Paxton, who was probably spent more time in close. Didn't he? He was on the sub with him, right?
He was on the sub not while filming Titanic, but when James Cameron was making Ghost of the Abyss, a documentary in like 2001, 2002. Actually, I think here's a weird one-act play. I believe James Cameron and Bill Paxton were diving on Titanic on September 11th, 2001.
Okay.
I may be embellishing that.
I hope you're not.
I know.
To his credit, Cameron did apologize for his outbursts on occasion. One of his assistant directors told the LA Times about a time when one of the extras complained about being fed raw chicken by the film's caterers, possibly dusted with PCP. And Cameron promised them he'd personally look into it. And he looked into it, the first AD said. Well, he personally screamed at 7 of us, and we had to look into it. The script supervisor, who shared several of the horror stories we recounted earlier, told Premiere, the other day, when they were doing the funnel drop scene, which is the scene when one of the smokestacks collapses, Jim says, "What do we have to do to get this right? Sacrifice another chicken?" The guy goes, "How do you not like that?" I mean, yeah, a favorite phrase of Cameron's is, "Any idiot could figure this out," justifying his problem solving. The Stephen Lang quote that the only things he can't do on set are act and cater. He wanted to do everything. Else, he would just adjust makeup. He would tweak blood spatters. Script supervisor Shelley Crawford would wonder, why does he do it? Why does everything have to be perfect? Why does the wave have to be 4 feet and not 2 feet? Why does the amplitude have to be exact? How does he decide? How does he? Questions for our time. The shoot dragged on longer than expected, perhaps obviously in hindsight. The filming schedule was supposed to be 135 days, grew to 160. James Cameron didn't drink caffeine because it supposedly made him meaner. Which, can you imagine? So he coped with his workload by taking vitamin B12 supplements and drinking wheatgrass. But other members of the cast and crew didn't cope quite so easily. Kate Winslet wrote in her production diary, which was later published in Vogue, "When I left the shoot, they were supposed to wrap on February 24th. But now it's March 14th, and they're still shooting. They've been shooting nights for 3 months, wrapping long after dawn most mornings, 7 days a week, for weeks, with 200 or 300 extras and dozens of stunt people and water and the cold air blowing off the ocean. People are tense. They want to go home. Hernando, the driver, says 2 security guards got into a fight."
This is like...
It just, if you overlay the Ken Burns Civil War, like sad fiddle music for that,
it's like an ill-fated expedition to the North Pole or something.
Diaries in the Trenches or something.
Day 76, we are out of food.
Hernando, the driver, says 2 security guards got into a fight. Throughout the production, there were rumors of on-set injuries and accidents that harkened back to the lawless days of Hollywood when human life was just part of the cost of that Tinseltown glamour. A Fox spokesman acknowledged 8 or 9 accidents. Those were just the ones that were acknowledged. Some reports cited more. One paramedic on the set, presumably of a fleet of them,
Yes.
told Premiere that in addition to run-of-the-mill respiratory infections, flus, fevers, stomach problems, diarrhea, he treated 1 broken ankle, some fractured ribs. What is Dutch elbow? Is that like tennis elbow?
I don't know. It might be just like ramming it into something. I don't know.
Head injuries, and a lot of bouts of hypothermia. There were also cases of extreme fatigue, with reports of crew members sleeping on their feet like horses, and leaning against walls. But an investigation by the Screen Actors Guild did not find any violations? Come on, SAG. Get your shit together. A further investigation by Time magazine revealed something even more disturbing. Though the American crew members were chauffeured to and from their hotels, local workers on the Mexican set were not. There was a case where a local woman was injured in a car crash after working until 3 a.m. as a script supervisor. These local workers were reportedly required to put in 12-hour days. You will remember they chose to build the Titanic set in Mexico because there were no labor unions there. Honestly, man, this makes his insistence on doing the VFX in Avatar so much clearer, because one of the big issues with like Marvel and VFX heavy stuff is that VFX gigs are not union. Wardrobe, makeup, set, all of those are union jobs. All of those like effects heavy Marvel movies where like these anonymous people are writing into Empire and Variety saying like, we've been in a bunker for 7 days, like retouching, Captain America's ass. Like those are not union gigs. So suddenly it makes sense to me that James Cameron spent 2 decades developing VFX technology that would enable him to skirt the entire human element of filmmaking. Anyway, there is a memo from a construction coordinator complaining that workers were fed only bread and milk in the morning as their meal for the day, and that was rolled back at one point. This memo, obtained by Time magazine, read in part, "It is deplorable that we have witnessed our workers digging through the trash to retrieve fruit and other foods to try and get something to eat. It's hard to believe that this company has stooped so low to reduce costs." One of Cameron's production partners, John Landau, not that one.
Not Bruce Springsteen's manager, no. For legal reasons.
Would that be amazing, though, if it was?
Oh, I checked. Believe me.
He responded to this allegation by saying that the Mexican workers on the film were treated far better than the norm in their country for these shoots. So, cool, man, I guess. Oh, and finally, one person died off the set in a drunk driving accident. So I know you can't really lay that at the feet of Jim.
So this is all bad. Generally, the crew got the full brunt of James Cameron's Midge character, but Kate Winslet also got it more than her fair share. Apparently, I've seen reports that James Cameron occasionally referred to her as Kate Weighs a Lot instead of Kate Winslet.
Woof.
Yeah, I think that was in the Rolling Stone profile of her in 1997. Of all the starring cast, it's safe to say that Kate had the worst time overall, and she admitted that there were times when she was, quote, genuinely frightened of Cameron. Just a quick misery list rundown. She caught pneumonia, almost drowned several times, chipped a bone in her elbow, and got so banged up that the makeup artist used her actual bruises as a photo reference to maintain continuity in the film. She told the LA Times that, quote, she looked like a battered wife, end quote. She said in retrospect that she found it weird that no one thought to ask her whether she could swim during the audition process. Cameron's response to this, I have to let actors who are adults take a certain responsibility for their own preparation, which kind of fair, I guess, but still. Obviously, Kate was subjected to the same grueling days we spoke about with the crew. She told the LA Times that her first day on the set started at 5 a.m. and went until 1 a.m. the following day. Nothing could have prepared me for it, she said. There were quite a few 20-hour days, and 2/3 of it was night shooting because the Titanic sank at night. It was every man for himself on the set. You had to ensure that you snatched some sleep during the day with a black eye mask on. Sometimes you'd find yourself having lunch at 2 a.m. or breakfast at 4 p.m. It was very disorienting. Excerpts from her production diary, which we talked about earlier, were published in Vogue magazine, are positively tragic. She speaks of having to spend an hour and a half before bed each night getting her hair put into pin curls with the help of a hairstylist. She writes, good thing we were both too tired to chat because half the time I'm asleep in the chair. On screen, I have luscious red curls. Off screen, I look like a bag lady with a headscarf tied in a bow at the front. So attractive. I think I've put on weight. I feel heavy, tired, physically swollen, and so lonely without my family. On February 6th, she writes, my feet are pulsating because they were so trampled on by all the steerage extras, third-class extras, like a herd of elephants. They reduced all my toes on my left foot to a pulpy mess in one take. And on February 16th, she says, I was wrapped early because I'd hurt my arm. I fell during a take, and since it was already sprained from something else this week, it just made it worse. I'm exhausted and ache like hell. I'm bruised and battered from head to foot. Just realized that this is the first time in ages that I'm going to sleep in the dark. It's night! Exclamation mark. And to cap it off, she told South Coast Today in 1997, for the first time in my life on a film set, I was thinking, I wish I wasn't here. Some days I'd wake up and think, please God, let me die. I could only imagine that was delivered with a laugh. Laughter mine.
James Cameron suddenly pokes his head in. No.
However, like many other members of the crew, Kate Winslet praised James Cameron's work ethic and commitment, admitting that as hard as Cameron pushed her, he pushed himself even harder. As she told the LA Times, by the end I was existing on about 4 hours of sleep a day, but Jim was existing on 3. In addition to the punishing hours, there was also the minor matter of hypothermia. For all the scenes shot inside the sinking ship, the crew and most of the cast were able to wear wetsuits, but this was impossible for Kate because of her costume, which was just a thin chiffon dress. Costume designer Deborah Lynn Scott had 24 of these dresses made due to the beating that they took after hours of being submerged in seawater. And this water was cold, pumped in straight from the ocean. Kate's gasp as she steps into the water for the first time after rescuing Leo from being handcuffed in the Master-at-Arms office. That's not acting. The coat that she wore didn't offer much warmth either, hence hypothermia. Interestingly, the coat was a size 8, while the rest of her gowns were size 4. They wanted it to be bigger on her in an attempt to make her look smaller and more vulnerable during the sinking scenes. They did a similar trick in the engine room by hiring shorter stuntmen. I think 5 feet was the cutoff, and that was just all done in an effort to make the engine room look bigger, which I appreciate. It's funny the random ways that they would try to cut costs. For all the, the dining room scenes, they got pounds of beluga caviar.
Yeah, we engraved the White Star Line logo on individual forks. And yet,
yeah. Kate Winslet hated this costume, not only because it offered her zero warmth, but also because the long flowing train kept getting caught on stuff, which is not good when your whole role is running through a rapidly flooding corridor. She wrote in her production diary, my dress is driving me bloody bonkers. I'm in the same dress till the end of the film. It's layers and layers of chiffon and layers of pain in the arse. It's supposed to trail behind me in the water like a long snail, but instead it keeps wrapping itself around my legs and tripping me up in the middle of shots, which is driving me mad. And because of this pain in the arse costume, Kate very nearly drowned while filming the sinking scenes inside the ship. It occurred while shooting the scene where Kate and Leo are trying to escape in the white hallway that rapidly fills up with water, only to find their path blocked by a locked gate. In the film, they open it just in time, but Kate's coat got caught on the gate during one of the takes, pinning her underwater. She explained, I had to sort of shimmy out of the coat to get free. I had no breath left. I thought I'd burst. And Jim just said, okay, let's go again. That was his attitude. I didn't want to be a wimp, so I didn't complain. Cameron later defended himself by saying, I knew Kate was pretty stoic. She never expressed to me that she didn't want to continue. It didn't come to me until about 10 minutes later that she was actually really shaken. It would not be unusual for Kate, after a really big emotional scene, to go and cry for an hour just as part of the process. Is that part of the process? In this scene, she was never in physical danger, he continued, but she perceived that she was. If you have a spill on a horse, you just get right back on the horse. This was a close-up shot and not a situation where she could be doubled. If I had to do this all over again, I would probably do the same thing, he said.
I learned nothing.
You'd be forgiven for wondering if Kate Winslet hates or at least hated James Cameron for all this. And as we mentioned, she was pretty vocal about what a miserable experience the movie was when speaking to the press. She even slammed him in the LA Times about the tremendous cost of the movie, saying, I normally don't even think about things like budgets, but everyone on set was talking about it. I believe in the end it was in excess of $160 million, actually $200 million. It makes you think, doesn't it? How many houses could you build for that money? How many people could you feed? Ooh. And then she came for Jim personally. Soon after the release of Titanic, she told The Guardian, Jim's a nice guy, but the problem was that his vision for the film was as clear as it was. He has a temper like you wouldn't believe. As it was, the actors got off lightly. I think Jim knew he couldn't shout at us the way he did to his crew because our performances would be no good. You'd have to pay me a lot of money to work with Jim again. James Cameron, who presumably was sleeping on a bed of money following the worldwide success of Titanic, didn't let the snarky comments in the press from his leading lady bother him. He said that Kate was, quote, just letting off steam after the pressure of shouldering a $200 million production. He added, Kate would look out and see this small city with these thousands of people and all this stuff happening, and she'd know that what it all boiled down to was what was going on in her eyes, which is sort of an uncharacteristically generous read on the situation from Jim Cameron. And surprise, surprise, Kate Winslet did indeed get paid a lot of money to appear in James Cameron's Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Considering it's obviously a water-based production, her salary must have been substantial. Kate Winslet and fellow actors took free diving lessons as part of their preparation for the production, and Kate trained to the point where she could hold her breath for an astonishing 7 minutes and 15 seconds. I don't understand how that's possible. She's destroyed Tom Cruise's previous record for on-screen breath holding, which was at 6 minutes for Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. I can't even begin to consider how that's done. Wow. Kate also has nice things to say about Jim Cameron these days. She told The Hollywood Reporter, it was so wonderful to work with Jim again. Time has changed him. Jim has become a father a few times over. He's a calmer person, chilled. You can just feel him enjoying it more this time.
So that's all nice. But back to Titanic. Leo, meanwhile, remained kind of a... Oh, he's a little let's not mince words.
Yeah.
What a little stinker he was. We talked about this in the first episode, but yeah. Despite being an accomplished scuba diver, Leo really hated being in cold water.
Aww.
I know. Well, this line really kills me. He admitted, the water stuff was really hard because I'm very temperature sensitive. Can you imagine how secure you must be to describe yourself as temperature sensitive and not expect to be torn apart? James Cameron jokingly called him a Persian cat, which is a tremendous diss. Kate helped him get used to the temperature for a few minutes prior to shooting each scene. And he later said that Titanic made a man out of me. They would apparently warm up after they would do these scenes by having the crew pour buckets of warm water over them. But before we move on, let's get to some lightning round bullet point details from the sinking scenes. In the shot where Kate Winslet breaks Jack's handcuffs with an axe, if you pause at just the right moment, you'll see that she actually hits his hand directly. Thankfully, the axe is made of rubber, and eagle-eyed viewers can actually see it bend.
I have an asinine factual error. Can I include that? The Master at Arms office where Jack is handcuffed was actually an inside cabin and had no porthole. Thank you.
I'm just impressed Cameron missed that.
Yeah, but they do have that great shot of the porthole like starting to be submerged underwater with Leo like peering out of it. Yeah.
I'm surprised he wasn't like, Kate, this is the real fire axe you will be using in this scene. Don't miss.
Make it count.
Let's go again. Leonardo was holding a bleeding stump. Jim's like, one more time. You'll remember the scene where Jack and Rose are running in slow motion down the white hallway, which was known as Scotland Road, being chased by the water. Those are stunt doubles doing the running, to which Kate and Leo's faces were digitally composited.
Looks real bad.
Even especially on 4K, baby.
Yeah.
You'll notice that the water that floods the ship is fairly clear, which is incorrect, according to NASA. Of all people,
ocean water. Friend of the pod, NASA.
Ocean water can appear murky and dark due to the marine life that it contains. So in real life, the rush of seawater would have been a terrifying brown wave, like poo water.
Friend of the pod, poo water.
Never gets old.
No.
And finally, the scene where Jack and his Irish friend Tommy Ryan pick up a bench in third class and smash open a gate resulted in more injuries. Do we have a running tally of how many of injury? Well, we're into like 24 at this point, right? Well, yeah. Leo threw out his precious little shoulder, and Barry caught himself in the chin with the bench. Again, they shot the wide shot for that scene, and Cameron goes, cut. All right, let's go again.
But wait, this is cute. I like this story, though.
Well, a child playing one of the extras got really upset because he thought he'd screwed up, and that was why they had to do it again. And everyone started to laugh, and James Cameron goes over and starts to talk to this little kid, and he takes him aside, and he's like, all right, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this again. Do you think you can do it like 3 times?
Because he didn't know that they had to do like wide shots and then close-ups and everything, and he just thought like he had screwed up, and I just thought that was really nice.
It's cute.
Take the time.
Like,
I mean, that little like taking the kid aside probably cost like $2.3 million, but but still,
that child would later grow up to be Sam Worthington, the star of Avatar.
I'd like to take a moment to discuss kind of a bummer point of fact. In nearly all dramatizations of the Titanic story, there's inevitably a scene that shows the third-class passengers locked behind gates, trapped down below in the bowels of the ship as it sinks, kept from the lifeboats in favor of the first and second-class passengers. It's certainly a powerful visual that illustrates the stark disparity between the socioeconomic classes on the Titanic, but it's not how it went down in real life. Numerous historians have commented on this. While there were gates, they existed not to keep the poorer passengers down below in the event of an emergency, but it was as part of a U.S. immigration law aimed to prevent the spread of disease. In other words, the immigrants had to be separated until they could be brought to Ellis Island for health checks and processing. This whole thing actually throws a real wrench into the plot of the movie about a first-class passenger having a relationship with a third-class passenger. In the book Real versus Real, How Hollywood Turns Fact into Fiction, author Frank Sinello quotes an anonymous historian who explains that on the actual Titanic, quote, the classes were strictly segregated. Leonardo DiCaprio wouldn't have been allowed anywhere near Kate Winslet. So all this to say, the gates were there, and some of them may have been closed or even locked in the initial confusion after the ship struck the iceberg, but they were opened very quickly. Historian and author Tim Moulton told the BBC Radio Times that the idea that the third-class passengers were locked below deck is, quote, total rubbish. As soon as the order was given to lower the lifeboats, the order was given to open all the gates, and there was no discrimination on the boat deck between first class or third. Even back in 1912, maritime law, friend of the pod maritime law, dictated that all passengers have access to the upper decks at all times. The third-class general room had a door that opened directly out onto what was known as the well deck. So, in truth, there were no physical barriers for third-class passengers to get to the boat deck and ultimately to the lifeboats. A man named Daniel Buckley was one of a handful of third-class passengers who made it to a boat, and according to testimony he gave at one of the official inquiries, the gate leading up from the steerage or third-class area was not locked, and those who'd been sleeping below had, according to him, as much a chance as anyone else to make it to the lifeboats. So, this leads to the devastating question, why did only 25% of third-class passengers, or 178 out of 706, survive the sinking, while 62% of first class survived and 41% of second class survived? It wasn't due to any malicious intent by the crew members on board, but a number of other factors, and we'll go over some of them now. Though they had access to the upper boat deck, third-class passengers did not have direct access to lifeboats, which were kept in the first and second class areas of the ship. To get there, they would need to know their way around parts of the ship where they'd never been. It was a maze of passageways and corridors. Even on the set for the third-class area on the Titanic production, cast and crew regularly got lost. It would sometimes take them upwards of 2 hours to come back from a lunch break because no one could find their way. So now imagine navigating that in the middle of a sinking in the middle of the night with limited lighting. Many third-class passengers just had no idea how to reach the boats, and by the time they did, they were gone because the first and second-class passengers had much easier and quicker access to them. Adding to the confusion, many of the third-class passengers didn't speak English and couldn't interpret what was going on or what they needed to do or where they needed to go. And also, many passengers in third class initially didn't want to abandon the ship at first, purely because they didn't realize that the Titanic was in any sort of mortal danger, at least until it was far too late. We'll touch on this more later, but this was a phenomenon that spread across all classes. People felt that staying on the big, warm, well-lit, and seemingly strong Titanic was much safer than taking their chances on what was essentially a rowboat at midnight in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic. Adding to the reluctance to leave the ship was the fact that many of these people were traveling with all their worldly possessions because they were going to go start a new life in America. As such, they were wary of leaving their luggage because it was all they had. And you also need to take into account the family size. In first and second class, most of the folks traveling were wealthy individuals or couples, but third class were full families because, again, many of them were repatriating. Generally, lower class families had more children because many factors meant more labor. It must be said, Irish Catholics, a lot of the third class passengers were Irish immigrants. Irish Catholics have big families.
Really?
Check with your priest. That's what I've heard. Boys of 13 or 14 were considered men in the eyes of sailors loading the lifeboats and not let aboard. And as a result, many mothers didn't want to leave their sons behind and split up the family, so they opted to stay behind. Grim. And finally, perhaps the most insidious reason, I call it the Eichmann excuse, most third-class passengers were used to following orders from their superiors. Remember the scene in Titanic when the mother tells her children that they were waiting their turn while the first and second class passengers were getting loaded up? That was much closer to reality than any of the alleged locked gates. It was a different era. It was a time when the crew members would say women and children first into the lifeboats, and hundreds of men would step back voluntarily and face almost certain death. There was a higher premium put on obedience at the time, so the third-class passengers gathered in public rooms, waiting for proper instructions from the crew, which, for the most part, really never came. The crew were so preoccupied with the chaos that the third-class passengers were essentially forgotten. Historian Don Lynch said that the third-class were essentially neglected to death, was his phrase, and it's true. Survivors reported seeing passengers in the third-class general room awaiting the end, including a Swedish man who apparently refused a lifebelt as he claimed to be, quote, too old to fight the Atlantic's waves. And there was also the sight of an English lady sitting and playing the piano with her child on her knee with no visible intention of trying to save herself and her child.
This is so grim.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the lifeboats themselves for a moment. There's a scene in the movie where Rose and her entourage are getting a tour of the upper decks of the Titanic by the ship's builder, Thomas Andrews, played by Victor Garber. He implies that he'd pushed for more lifeboats to be added, but was overruled. It's a huge part of the Titanic legend that the Titanic was sailing without enough lifeboats because they wanted unspoiled boat deck views for their rich passengers. And the ship was unsinkable, supposedly, so that they would not need them anyway. These days, it seems criminal that a ship would set sail without lifeboat space for all the passengers and crew. And so clearly the owners of the Titanic had committed some kind of act of gross negligence, right? Well, not strictly. In fact, the Titanic was sailing with more than the legal requirement of lifeboats at the time. And this is weird because the ship had 20 lifeboats in total that could accommodate 1,178 people, or a little over half of the 2,223 on board the night it sank, or about a third of its maximum capacity of 3,547 passengers and crew. But you have to understand that at the time the Titanic was built, the safety laws had been put in place at the end of the 19th century. British Board of Trade regulations for lifeboats were based on the ship's gross tonnage, or weight, not the number of passengers that it was carrying. So when the law was written, they essentially said all ships over 10,000 gross tons should have 16 lifeboats, because that was the size of the biggest ships at the time. This law did not evolve to keep pace with the new superliners. So Titanic had a gross tonnage of 46,000 tons, so by law, she was only required to have 16 lifeboats that could safely hold 1,060 people, and she had actually 4 extra boats for a total of 20.
So in other words, I mean, these laws were, I mean, the biggest ships that the lawmakers could conceive of were 10,000 tons at the turn of the 19th century.
And Titanic was 4.5 times that big.
Yes.
And the other thing, too, is that builders hadn't really even conceived of a situation in which the entire ship would be evacuated at one time. Lifeboats were designed to shuttle passengers to rescue ships.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on arcane, centuries-old maritime safety laws, but I believe that ships built with certain kinds of safety features were rewarded by being required to carry fewer boats, simply because the belief was that they wouldn't be needed. These safety features that they added would prevent, or at least slow, any sinking, and the newly established shipping lanes in the North Atlantic meant that vessels would be a limited distance away, something like 60 miles. I mean, it's like your car breaking down on a very crowded highway. You know, you're in trouble, there's going to be someone coming along soon. So that was kind of the thinking. So in short, the White Star Line did nothing wrong, technically.
And now to an even more controversial point. It's been theorized that more lifeboats wouldn't have actually helped save more people. Sure. For the reasons we will now outline. Are we going to get angrily tweeted with Titanic survivors because of this?
Oh, they're all dead.
As we touched on earlier, for the first hour after the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., passengers were reluctant to get into the boats. In fact, the first few were launched with less than 20 people in them when they were capable of holding 65. People did not want to get into them, and the reasons why became apparent during the filming of the Titanic, the movie. Cameron had commissioned the Welland Company, the original company who built the lifeboat davits, which are the little cranes that you launch the boats, to replicate what they'd done on the ship. And in fact,
on the actual ship.
Yeah. And in fact, they reinforced them slightly more than the vintage versions. But even so, these things bounce up and down in a truly terrifying way that gave the impression that they were going to snap. So, picture it. Lifeboats were swung off the boat deck, suspended by these bouncing, seemingly rinky-dink cranes over a 90-foot, 9-story drop into the freezing Black Sea below. Passengers were not interested.
Yeah, I mean, the Titanic at this point, you couldn't even tell that it was sinking. It was bright, it was warm, it was huge. It just, it kind of makes sense.
Get into the rattly, bouncy death trap. No.
Rich people.
Famously, a lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the morning of April 14th, the day the Titanic struck the lifeberg, but it was canceled because the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, allegedly wanted to deliver one last Sunday service before he went into full retirement at the end of the voyage. He would die in the sinking. So, these boats were an unknown quantity to the passengers, and it's little surprise that people preferred to stay on the safe ship. John Jacob Astor, the richest man aboard, was heard to say to his wife, "We are safer here than in that little boat." He also died. With his dog, right?
Yeah, possibly.
The crew, if they knew the seriousness of the situation in the beginning, were put in the difficult position of trying to convey urgency without starting a panic. This gets grimmer and grimmer.
I mean, a lot of them didn't even know. A lot of the lower ranking crew members. So if they were aware at all that there was a problem, they were trying to strike a balance between, urgency without terrifying these people. Since, as we established, there wasn't enough boat space for all on board.
The first boats that were launched early in the sinking, to a third of their capacity, were ordered to return to the ship to receive more passengers, but they kept rowing away for fear of being swamped once that they saw the ship was in serious danger. Someone aboard one of these uttered the famous line, "It's our lives now." That is just a grim line. People are the worst. So by the time passengers started willingly heading towards the boats, it has been theorized that there wouldn't have been enough time to even launch all of them. As it stood, the last 2 lifeboats to leave the Titanic weren't even launched. They just floated off the ship as it sank. One of which, Collapsible B, that's my rap name, was upside down, and 30 men balanced on top of it all night as the air pocket underneath leaked and it slowly sank lower and lower into the water. Oh, it's like working in digital media. In the 2017 documentary Titanic, 20 years later with James Cameron, he tests the notion that more people would have been saved had there been more lifeboats. After calculating the time it would take to ready, load, and lower a boat, he concluded that more lifeboats actually would have been a hindrance, saying, "I think if you had more lifeboats on that ship, they would have just gotten in the way and would have cost hundreds of lives." As an interesting aside for pedantic memorabilia buffs like yourself.
Yeah.
You rang. The whereabouts of the Titanic's lifeboats are unknown. 13 of the 20 were deposited on the White Star Line's New York dock by the rescue ship Carpathia, with the rest set adrift on the ocean. One, Collapsible A, that's your rap name, was recovered in the open ocean weeks later and brought to New York with the others, bringing the total of recovered ships to 14.
I think there were some bodies in it, too.
Souvenir hunters pillaged many of the nameplates and other items from inside, including an emergency hardtack pilot biscuit, which still exists and was sold in 2018 for $23,000.
Worth every penny.
I was going to say, was it you?
That's my Christmas gift, yeah, to myself.
But the lifeboats, these priceless and depressing artifacts from this historic night, have vanished. It's believed that they were either scrapped, left to rot in New York, or quietly redistributed to other vessels sometime after the sinking. Can you imagine finding out one of your lifeboats on your ship was repurposed from the Titanic?
I mean, that's why I said quietly. I have a story that I don't have any room for, but this is maybe a good time to mention it. So the Titanic had an identical sister ship, or almost identical sister ship, the Olympic, and she was relatively near the crash site or the sinking site, and she radioed the rescue ship, because the ship that rescued the survivors, the Carpathia, was a small ship. She offered to come by and pick up the Titanic survivors. And everyone was like, no, all of these people just saw 1,500 people die when the ship went down. And now an identical sister ship will come out of the ocean like a terrifying ghost ship. And they're going to go have to board the ship that looks identical to the one where they just watched their family die on. No, they're not going to want to board that ship. No, stay away.
Considering there was a shortage of lifeboats after the change in regulations following the Titanic disaster, and these Titanic boats were basically new since the ship was on her maiden voyage, the fact that they would have gotten reused does make sense. There are some people who claim to have an original Titanic lifeboat, but none have been authenticated. It has been claimed that one of the prop boats filmed in the Alfred Hitchcock movie Lifeboat in 1944 was a Titanic survivor, but it is believed that this was just some PR sleight of hand, smoke and mirrors. In 2013, a lifeboat was found abandoned in a hedge in England and purchased off eBay. It was originally bought in Liverpool, where items from White Star Line ships were deposited after the ships were decommissioned. It is the same size, shape, type of wood, and build quality of White Star Line lifeboats of the period, but it has not been authenticated. The only White Star Line lifeboat of the Titanic era in existence today is from a passenger tender, the SS Nomadic, which is docked in Belfast, Ireland. But there remains a possibility that some of the original Titanic lifeboats are out there, unknown to the owners. If you were a friend...
That's very fascinating to me. I'm very interested in that.
I'm just mortified by the idea that someone's lifeboat was maybe a Titanic lifeboat. That's bad juju.
Yeah. No, I agree. Now we're going to tell some heroic stories from the real-life sinking of the Titanic, many of which were dramatized in James Cameron's movie. The Titanic film reenacts the last moments of numerous real-life figures on board, and it's a devastating but also fascinating study of human behavior. There's the scene where the American millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet change into tuxedo dinner jackets, complete with roses in the buttonholes. And Guggenheim supposedly said, "We're dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And they were last seen in the grand staircase, smoking cigars and drinking brandy. Hence the line that James Cameron added, spoken by Guggenheim, "We're dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen, but we would like a brandy." They both went down with the ship, and their bodies were never recovered. One millionaire's body that was recovered was that of, I really shouldn't have phrased that in such a cheery way, was that of John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. And he was believed to be among the wealthiest men on the planet, with a personal fortune estimated at 87 million or 2.44 billion in today's dollars. Although this is all pre-income tax, I'm surprised that the fortunes back then weren't like truly insane. But appropriately enough, John Jacob Astor's body was recovered with a gold watch, gold and diamond cufflinks, diamond ring, $2,440 in American bills, and hundreds more in other assorted currencies.
On his person?
On his person, yes.
Like strapped to his body?
In a wallet, I guess, or billfold, or whatever they called them back then.
How do you have $2,400 in a... Whatever. Good. F*** him.
Good.
Astors. Sorry.
Think of where he is. Think of where you are. There is a persistent myth that his body was covered in ash when it was picked up by a recovery ship a week after the sinking. This led to the theory that his body was crushed by a falling smokestack. possibly the one that killed Fabrizio in the Titanic movie. There are conflicting reports about whether or not his body was actually covered in ash, but this is the version that James Cameron went with. To film Astor's death, they needed to use 120 tons of water, and as a result, there was no way for the actor playing Astor, Eric Braeden, to actually rehearse it before filming. And he later explained that preparing for that scene mentally was terrifying, probably for several reasons. Turns out that Eric Braeden is a survivor of the single most deadly sinking in history. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a cruise ship built by Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And in 1945, the ship was being used to evacuate civilians from the Baltic ahead of the advancing Russian army. And on January 30th, 1945, the ship was being used to evacuate civilians from the Baltic ahead of the advancing Russian army. And she was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine, resulting in the death of 9,400 people, nearly 6 times as many who died aboard the Titanic. Eric Braeden, the guy who played John Jacob Astor, and I think he's a soap star too, was one of the 1,252 people who survived this disaster. So, all in all, I'm kind of shocked he agreed to sign on for Titanic. Can't imagine he wanted to relive that.
James Cameron bullied him into it.
Yeah, maybe. We touched on this in the first half of the episode, but James Cameron went to insane lengths working with extras to ensure the film's authenticity. He gave hundreds of them elaborate backstories corresponding to real-life figures on board, and essentially choreographed them on the deck as they were in real life. Billy Zane, who played Rose's fiancé Cal, later told the Daily Beast, "One night towards the climax, it was about 4:30 a.m., and the ship is dipping into the very chilly Pacific waters, and 2,000 people are scrambling towards the stern or back of the ship. James Cameron yells, 'Cut.' He climbs onto the deck from the crane basket, swinging him around with the sky cam, goes up to an extra, who's this old lady, and says, 'You're not just running. You need to go down to B deck because your daughter told you she forgot something very dear, her wedding ring, and she's going down there and you gave her 5 minutes and she's taken 10 and you regret making that choice.'" And Billy Zane continues, "He's giving this backstory to a background artist, which elevated the moment for her and spread like wildfire to the other extras." And there's a scene in Titanic where a father places his daughter into a lifeboat and says, "It's goodbye for a little while, only for a little while." And this was the testimony from a little girl. I think it was Ava Hart, who's a famous Titanic survivor, who remembered those as the last words her father ever said to her. And here's a little detail that I don't believe made it into James Cameron's Titanic film, but I think it was included in the almost as famous Night to Remember film from the 50s, and it's always fascinated me. This is the story of Edith Rosenbaum and her pig. First-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum had a plush toy pig with a wind-up music box inside that she kept for good luck. It had been a gift from her mother after her mother, was injured in an early road traffic accident. And when the Titanic began sinking, she left her 19 trunks in her room, but took this pig up to the boat deck. This woman, Edith Rosenbaum, she's very fascinating. She once had this great quote, "I've had every kind of disaster but the bubonic plague and a husband." So she's got personality. Initially, she, like so many, didn't want to board a lifeboat. And she said in a TV interview in 1970, "I never would have left the ship, but a sailor came along and he said, 'Hey, you don't want to be saved? Well, I'll save your baby.' And he grabbed this pig from under my arm and tossed it into the lifeboat. And when they threw that pig, I knew it was my mother calling to me." Clearly, the sailor thought that this toy pig was a baby and tossed it into the lifeboat so she would follow him. So, to amuse the children on her boat, Boat 11, and generally help keep spirits up because it was a crowded boat and some of the people had to stand for hours in the freezing cold on the ocean, which couldn't have been fun, Edith Rosenbaum would wind up her toy pig by the tail and play a little song that was later identified as La Sorella, folk song. The pig survived and is currently at the Royal Maritime Museum. And amazingly, the music box still plays. A clip has been shared online. I think for years, people weren't sure what the song actually was. So they recorded it and put it online and hoped that, would kind of crowdsource trying to find the identity of the song. I'd like to play it now. Imagine, if you would, being in a tiny open lifeboat just before dawn in the freezing North Atlantic, blackness all around you, and hearing this echoing in the water.
Why was everything so creepy back then?
Yeah. Like the doll in the earlier episode and this. Yeah. Well, to help erase just a smidge of that haunting anecdote, I want to share that Edith met up years later with a man named Frank X, who was one of the boys she'd entertained in the boat as a 10-month-old. And she, I guess, busted out her pig and played it for him again as a grown man. Presumably, this was before PTSD was a thing. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment. There's the famous scene in the Titanic film where an elderly man is refused entry into a lifeboat. We talked about this earlier. His wife refuses to leave him, saying, "We've been together for many years, and where you go, I go. As we have lived, so we will die together." This is Isidor and Ida Strauss, a well-known German-American couple. A friend wanted to ask an officer about letting Isidor board the boat, but he refused to go while there were still women and children on board. Does that kind of chivalry exist now?
No.
Yeah, no.
He
Okay.
would have shoved a kid out of the way and hit the dab.
Yep. Isidore is famous both because he was a congressman and perhaps most likely because he was the co-owner of Macy's department store in New York. And Isidore and Ida Strauss's great-great-grandchild is the singer King Princess, which is fascinating to me. Isidore and Ida did indeed die together. James Cameron shows them embracing in bed as their room rapidly floods. This is a bit of dramatic license, as they were last seen sitting in deck chairs. And Isidore's body was later recovered floating in the ocean days later, which wouldn't have been possible if they'd been in their suite. He's buried at New York's Woodlawn Cemetery, along with an urn filled with water from the wreck site in tribute to Ida, who was never found. The Strauss Mausoleum bears the following biblical verse from Song of Solomon 8:7. "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it."
Okay. Woo! Gird your loins, people. We're not even halfway through this bitch. The recovery vessels retrieved just over a fifth of those lost in the sinking. Approximately 335 of the 1,496 people who died. Roughly 110 to 125 of these were buried at sea, either because of the poor state of the body or, more often, because they appeared to be of a lower class or crew. Roughly 60 or so were taken back to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and transported elsewhere for burial, like Isidor Strauss to New York. But the vast majority remained in Halifax. 121 victims are buried at the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, 19 at Mount Olivet Catholic Cemetery, and 10 at the Baron de Hirsch Jewish Cemetery. Not to be ghoulish, we're going somewhere with this. And the place that we are going is that there is a grave marker for a J. Dawson at the Fairview Lawn Cemetery. Naturally, following the release of the Titanic movie, fans freaked out, believing that they had found the final resting place of Leo's character, Jack Dawson. In truth, the marker is for a 23-year-old Irishman named Joseph Dawson, a member of the ship's crew who worked as a coal trimmer. Cameron claimed that he had no idea this guy existed when he named the character. Despite this, it has become one of the most widely visited graves at the cemetery. The Titanic production visited the cemetery at one point while they were filming in the area, and Bill Paxton later recalled being extremely affected by the inscription on the gravestone for a young officer, which read, "Each man stood at his post while all the weaker ones went by and showed once more to all the world how Englishmen should die." Speaking of Titanic officers doing their duty, we should talk about the depiction of First Officer William Murdoch, played in the James Cameron movie by Ewan Stewart. James Cameron paints this guy as sort of a cowardly weasel. He's the one that Cal tries to bribe for a place in the lifeboat, with pedantic fact punch-in, bills that did not technically exist until 2 years after the ship sank.
Yep.
CinemaSins voice. Then he shoots Jack's friend Tommy Ryan and another passenger during a mad rush for the boats, and finally he shoots himself in the head. In real life, things went down somewhat differently. In fact, First Officer Murdoch is seen as something of a hero in the real-life sinking of the Titanic. He oversaw lifeboats on one entire side of the ship, having launched half before his counterpart on the other side had even launched one. He helped 10 boats get away, and then went around throwing deck chairs overboard to serve as makeshift rafts before he ultimately died, likely not by his own hand. There were reports of people being shot that night, A letter written by a steerage passenger from Norway surfaced days after the movie was released that read, "Some were shot when they wanted to crawl their way into the boats." But there is no evidence that Murdoch had anything to do with this, and his surviving family were extremely angry when they saw the film. Cameron later said that he regretted his decision to portray this man as a murderer. In the case of First Officer William McMaster Murdoch, I took the liberty of showing him shoot somebody and then shoot himself. He's a named character, he wasn't a generic officer. We don't know that he did that, but the storyteller in me says, oh. I start connecting the dots. He was on duty, he's carrying all this burden with him, and it made him an interesting character. But I was being a screenwriter. I wasn't thinking about being a historian, and I think I wasn't as sensitive about the fact that his family might feel offended by that, and they were. The vice president of 20th Century Fox traveled to Murdoch's homeland of Dalbatty, Scotland, to apologize to Murdoch's then 80-year-old nephew and present a $5,000 donation to Dalbatty High School to boost the school's William Memorial Prize, or in other words, 0.000000001% of what the movie grossed. Sorry we made your uncle into a bastard for the ages in the highest grossing movie of all time. Here is a pittance. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, played by Victor Garber, is also given shabby treatment in the Cameron movie. He's shown as compassionate and smart, but a bit of a wimp at the end, standing comatose in the first-class smoking room, staring off into space, completely broken by the fact that his ship is going to founder and kill hundreds. Rose confronts him by saying, "Aren't you going to try for it?" And he just smiles meekly and hands her a life jacket. In reality, Andrews took a much more proactive role that night, working hard to save the passengers. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, there are multiple reports of Andrews arguing with passengers who simply didn't believe that the ship would sink. He was seen throwing chairs and other buoyant objects into the water for people to grab onto. And like he does in the movie, he gave away his life jacket, resigned himself to his fate, either to give one more person a spot in a lifeboat, or because he felt duty-bound to go down with his ship. Oh, this one. This is the one that still kills me.
Oh, yeah.
One group portrayed as heroes in Titanic were the ship's band. The 8 players, led by Wallace Hartley, played cheery music on deck to help keep passengers calm and avoid a panic until the bitter end, leading to one of the most enduring legends of the ship's sinking, which happens to be completely true. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered after the sinking, with his violin in its case still strapped to him. It was a gift from his fiancée and bore the plaque, "For Wallace on the occasion of our engagement from Maria." It was sold in 2013 for $1.7 million and is now on display at a museum in Tennessee dedicated to victims of the sinking. Unfortunately, the moisture from the water cracked the instrument and it is no longer playable. So the last song played on it was in fact the last song played on the Titanic. But that specific song is still up for debate. In the movie, they play the hymnal "Nearer My God to Thee," but a few have claimed to have heard "Song d'Automne," a then-current pop hit. One man who heard this was wireless operator Harold Bride, who was one of the men who'd been radioing for help. He was on the deck until he was literally washed off, so he is a credible witness. Bandleader Wallace Hartley himself was interviewed prior to the sinking and was eerily asked what song he would play in the event of an emergency. According to Snopes.com, Hartley responded with 2 songs, one of which was "Nearer My God to Thee." It was reportedly Hartley's favorite hymn, and it was regularly played at the funerals of members of the Musicians Union. Oof. The problem with "Nearer My God to Thee" is that it's not a song, but more of a set of lyrics. There are 2 melodies that traditionally accompany it. In England, it is traditionally accompanied by a tune called Horbury, and in America, the melody is called Bethany. Most versions of the Titanic story, including James Cameron, use the American version, Bethany, which you will punch in here. But the band was British, so it does stand to reason that they played the British version, which you will punch in here. There's a good chance that this was the last song played on the Titanic. Grim. Really grim stuff. Did he actually say, gentlemen, it's been an honor playing with you this evening?
That I don't know. I think that might have been a James Cameron embellishment.
Oof. Anyway, it's hard to think of Nearer My God to Thee without thinking of the image of the captain standing on the bridge in the wheelhouse as all the windows shatter. One of the scariest scenes of the movie, and almost certainly James Cameron's creation. Most witnesses saw the captain dive off the bridge just as it began to submerge, and presumably he then froze to death in the water. But there have been other myths that have him heroically rescuing a baby and delivering it to a lifeboat before swimming off. Another version has him cheering on a bunch of men balancing on top of the overturned collapsible boat. All sounds like stuff his relatives yelled in a crowded room. Hey, we actually saw him put a baby on a lifeboat. Yeah.
Or some Hearst paper stuff.
Yeah. No, he was actually, I think I saw him cheering on a bunch of guys who survived. Who said that? The scene where the captain, played by Bernard Hill, is engulfed by the flooding in the wheelhouse was apparently the very last scene to be filmed for the movie prior to reshoots. It was part of an all-night shoot that was mandated to make up for lost time. And although the stuntman was equipped with a breathing regulator, James Cameron was in the cabin himself wearing a diving suit during the sun in case he had to supply emergency oxygen to the stuntman. All went well, and afterwards, Cameron had a brief wrap party with the remaining crew members where he drank half a bottle of tequila. And when he was finally taken home, he had already fallen asleep in the van before it left the studio, dreaming of abusing other crew members. with abused crew members dancing, visions of abused crew members dancing like sugar plums in his head.
Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but James Cameron had every right to be exhausted because destroying the Titanic was, as we previously established, very hard work. The flooding of the dining room scenes was exhausting because they'd flood it over and over and over again, and after each take, they'd have to meticulously set it all back up again and reset each multi-course place setting. But this is arguably preferable to how things were done to show the flooding of the Grand Staircase, which was a one-shot deal. The Grand Staircase is arguably the most iconic room on the Titanic, and in the film, it's practically its own character. That's where Jack enters the world of first class before the dinner party scene, and if you look closely in 4K, you can see a Steadicam operator's reflection in the glass when the steward opens the vestibule door for him, which is funny.
I wonder if James Cameron is like haunted by cinema sins, like this kind of shit. If he like stays up late at night Googling errors in Titanic and just like grinding his teeth.
Well, we will talk a little later about some of the things that he fixed for the 2012 3D re-release. The Grand Staircase is also the room where Rose meets Jack immediately after the dinner party scene where he invites her to go to a real party. And of course, it's shown in the final scene of the movie when Rose reunites with Jack in the fantasy sequence, the meaning of which is perhaps the second most hotly debated topic in this film, and we'll get into that more later. James Cameron rebuilt 4 stories of this 6-story staircase on a soundstage. And this wasn't a set. It was a full-scale structure made of solid oak. And interestingly, they actually made the staircase 18 inches wider on either side because, to quote James Cameron, people now are just bigger.
What a body-shaming asshole he is. Kate weighs a lot. I have to make the staircase wider because people are fatter. He's coming after. He's coming after the Na'vi next.
I mean, you go into like colonial houses and you walk up the stairs and your feet can't even fit on them.
Yeah, people were smaller back then.
Yeah. They even built the massive glass dome above the stairs, which is 24 feet in diameter. But sadly, it was all destroyed when they shot the sinking scene and dumped water into it. Obviously, since this was a one-shot deal, they planned it out like a lunar landing and, made sure that nobody had the lens cap on or anything like that. It proved to be extremely dangerous. The water flooded the structure from multiple sides with such force that it caused the staircase itself to rip free from its foundation and float up. As Cameron explained, the staircase has got a steel footing. Then when we sank the ship, it lifted. Wood is buoyant. it ripped off that footing and it all floated up, and it actually pinned 2 stunt players to the ceiling. Fortunately, they weren't hurt, but it was a pretty scary moment. And this is interesting because it may go a long way in solving a long brewing mystery about the wreck of the Titanic. When Dr. Robert Ballard, the guy who discovered the Titanic, first dove on the wreck in 1986, the Grand Staircase was one of the first places he visited, and he was disappointed to find that it was basically just a big gaping hole. There were some pillars and chandeliers, but the staircase itself and the famous clock and all the ornate woodwork was nowhere to be found, and it was assumed that wood-boring organisms had eaten it over the previous 7 decades. But later missions went further inside the ship, and they found lots of other wooden elements elsewhere. And also, the staircase contained a tremendous amount of wrought iron decorations, which theoretically would have fallen to the bottom of the staircase hole if the wood had gotten eaten away. Instead, there was nothing there at all, as if the staircase itself had just vanished. Cameron's production may have inadvertently proven a theory that the buoyant staircase had broken free from its foundation during the sinking and shot up out of the hole where the glass dome had been until moments before. And some eyewitnesses had recalled seeing what they believed to be the ship rapidly rising out of the water in the chaos of the last minutes. This could have very well been the staircase just exiting the ship and shooting straight up. And there's also a story that I have been unable to verify or even track down. It exists purely in my memory because I find it so haunting. I think it's from a book by the historian Charles Pellegrino, who's semi-disgraced for telling tall tales, but I just would like to share it. There were claims that passengers on a ship passing through the wreck site the day after the sinking saw what appeared to be a multi-story structure off in the distance with figures waving on it. Then it became blocked by sheets of pack ice, and officers on board the ship convinced the witnesses that they had seen just a bunch of seals on an iceberg. Ultimately, they steamed off without investigating, but there's a possibility, albeit remote, that the Grand Staircase formed a massive piece of debris that dozens clung to until they either starved, froze, or the structure became waterlogged and sank, and they all drowned. Anyway, a fact that's only slightly less upsetting, the ruined remains of the Grand Staircase from the Titanic movie production was destroyed and sold as scrap metal rather than being repaired and turned into some sort of a museum. The most harrowing action scenes were filmed as the Titanic sank lower into the water, snapping in two before its back end or stern rose into the air, sticking out of the water at a 90-degree angle like a skyscraper in the middle of the North Atlantic, with Jack and Rose holding onto the top for dear life. Cameron later said that he felt like all the previous Titanic movies depicted the final plunge as this graceful affair with the ship just drifting beneath the waves, and he wanted to go a very different route and depict the moment, quote, as the terrifyingly chaotic event that it really was. And this sequence required a full-size set built on hydraulic lifts so they could tilt, with 150 extras and 100 stunt performers sliding down hundreds of feet like a giant slide, bouncing off railings and propellers on the way. And some of the stunt performers had rollers and ball bearings fitted into the back of their life belts and costumes so the deck wouldn't have to be tilted quite so much. They'd get a push off camera, or they were pulled also off camera with a zip cord, and they would just go flying. And even though the deck was only angled about 6 degrees, they could tilt the camera so it looked like they were, just letting gravity do the work. But there were some scenes where the set really was straight up and down vertically, and they rehearsed this scene for weeks with necessary safety measures put in place. The stunt performers were suspended by harnesses and wires, and also much of the set was either coated in foam or made of rubber. If you look closely at some of the people sliding down the back of the ship and hitting equipment like winches or bollards sticking out of the deck, you can see that the supposedly metal stuff actually bends because it's made of rubber. They didn't want these people to get hurt when they rammed into it. Despite these precautions, this was still no joke. Even with harnesses, the stern would point 100 feet or 10 stories straight up. One stuntman broke his leg and a stuntwoman fractured her rib, leading Cameron to halt some of the more dangerous stunts. And instead, he uses a mix of stunt people and CGI, with real people sometimes transforming into CGI, sometimes in the same shot, which is very impressive considering the technology for this was still in its infancy. They'd use motion capture footage of people who needed to fall many, many feet and hit things like the propeller most famously. The split of the ship was done with the aid of a 1/35th size model packed with explosives to break apart as needed. Obviously, the moment when the Titanic rips in two is extremely dramatic. It breaks above the waterline, and the back end falls back into the water, resulting in a massive tidal wave. In other words, it's pretty hard to miss. And this is interesting because about half of the survivors of the Titanic sinking believe that the ship sank in one piece. Granted, it was a lot darker in real life than Cameron's film would have you believe, considering it was a moonless night. Once the ship's lights failed, the Titanic was mostly visible to people in lifeboats purely as a silhouette that blotted out the stars. So that may have been a factor as to why so many people didn't see it break apart. Another theory is that it actually broke in a somewhat less dramatic fashion below the waterline. As part of the aforementioned Titanic 20 years later with James Cameron documentary, Cameron tested this out with a large model and determined that he got it wrong in his film, but he wasn't sure how. As he said in the documentary, we found out that you could have the stern sink vertically, or you could have the stern fall back with a big splash, but you can't have both. So the film got it wrong on one point or the other. I tend to think it's wrong on the fallback of the stern because of what we see on the wreck. Despite this flub, Cameron was justifiably proud of his work depicting the Titanic's final moments on the surface, and footage from those scenes were featured prominently in the trailer, and Cameron later commented, "That shot alone of the ship breaking in two got our opening weekend audience." Before we move on, we need to talk briefly about a man named Charles Jocelyn, I think is how you say his name. He's the man in white next to Jack and Rose as they hang onto the railing on the stern as the ship goes down. He was the chief baker on the Titanic and is widely believed to be the last man off Titanic. He held onto the stern and rode it down to the water like an elevator, as he later described, without getting his head wet. His survival story is insane and sometimes goes beyond the realms of believability, but it's generally taken as factual. He's something of a folk hero, and I think he's our actual friend of the pod, Dora's favorite Titanic survivor, so this story's for Dora. In his role as the chief baker, he sent his men up to the lifeboats to load them up with loaves of bread and provisions. Then he went to the boat deck himself to help load the boats, and when people refused, insisting that they wanted to stay on board the ship, he would physically grab them and throw them into the boat, which, not great bedside manner, but appreciated. He was supposedly offered a job of captaining one of the lifeboats, but he saw there were several other sailors inside the boat, so he refused, opting to stay aboard the ship. And by this point, all the boats were gone, so he busied himself throwing upwards of 50 deck chairs overboard to act as ad hoc rafts in the water. And when there was nothing else left to do, he went and poured himself a stiff drink. Or several, accounts vary. When the Titanic began to break in two, he ran to the stern, held onto the guardrail on the outside of the ship, and rowed it down into the water. And here's where it gets crazy. Or even crazy.
Here's where it gets crazy?
Yeah. The water is 28 degrees, or 4 degrees below freezing. Human beings can only survive in water that cold for about 20 minutes if you're being generous, more like 15. He somehow was able to tread water for several hours while clutching debris. And at daybreak, he finally saw the overturned collapsible B lifeboat and swam over to it, but there was no room for him on it, so he clung on, half in, half out, with his legs dangling in the water until a second lifeboat came by. He swam to that boat and was pulled in, and miraculously, he was fine. The only damage he suffered was some swollen feet. He attributed his good fortune to the alcohol in his system, which he believed kept him warm and insulated. Doctors will insist that that's not how it works physiologically. Amazingly, this was the second time he had survived the shipwreck. He was also aboard the SS Oregon in 1886, which also had enough lifeboats for only half the people on board. He died in 1956 at the age of 78 in Paterson, New Jersey.
That is mind-boggling.
I do wonder how much of this he made up, but it's taken as fact.
God love him. Well, where are we in the depressing count? What's
Kate Winslet almost dies again. That's where we're at.
Okay. Cool. Well, although it might have been slightly easier to shoot than the sinking scenes, all the footage of passengers thrashing around in the water brought hazards of its own, especially for Kate Winslet, who, as we mentioned before, had the most miserable time on the set. The final scene that she shot was the one after the Titanic slipped beneath the waves and she and Leo are pulled underwater, spinning around chaotically as the stern of the ship disappears behind them, beginning its 2.5-mile descent to the ocean floor. For these close-ups, Kate and Leo needed to be weighed down to the bottom of a tank that she described as 12 feet deep. She later said, looking back, "I can't believe I allowed that to be done to me." That and the Leo fart jackets. Leo, who's scuba certified, stayed by her side and would stroke her legs in time with the breathing so that she wouldn't get flustered. Unfortunately, she had a problem using an air regulator to inhale air and swallowed mouthfuls of water while unable to kick her way to the surface. After 3 takes, she said, "I simply said I couldn't do any more." I just want to tell everyone that Jordan titled this next section, "Drowning in Freezing Piss."
Sometimes just the most simple explanation.
The muse just flows through you. This brings us to some of the most disturbing scenes in the movie. He said gleefully, like a true crime podcast host, describing how someone was raped and murdered, dismembered. Depicting 1,500 people freezing to death in the North Atlantic. In reality, as we said earlier, the water was 28 degrees or 4 degrees below freezing. According to the Red Cross, hypothermia would have killed many people in as little as 15 minutes because you lose heat faster in water. Earlier in the movie, when Jack is persuading Rose not to jump off the back of the ship, he tells the story of falling through some thin ice as a boy and the water feeling like being stabbed with 1,000 knives all over your body. That is a direct quote taken from Titanic survivor Charles Lightoller, who served as the second officer on the ship. The water in the massive tank on the set of Titanic wasn't that cold, but it was still very cold. Cameron was faced with the problem of keeping it cold enough that it didn't steam like a jacuzzi, but also warm enough that people didn't die, which assuredly he didn't like.
The director's quandary.
He told People magazine in 2012, "The water in the tank was about 80 degrees, so it was really like a pool. All of the cold, frigid breath was added later. It was real breath filmed and composited in, which seems like a ridiculous thing to do."
Hashtag James Cameron, baby.
It was about 3 feet deep, although there were deeper areas that people would dive into off the boat set because you're not supposed to dive in less than 3 feet of water. And while the water may have started at 80 degrees, it did not stay that warm simply because there was so much of it. By most accounts, including Kate Winslet's, the temperature for that tank was more like 60 degrees, which doesn't sound that bad, but imagine being submerged in that for hours. They had mid-level production supervisors acting as guinea pigs to see how long they could safely stay submerged in the unheated outdoor tank, and they determined several hours would be just fine. Can you imagine learning where you fall in the production hierarchy of just not high enough to get points off the back end, not low enough to be shot at by James Cameron, but right in the lower middle where they make you stand in 60-degree water before your legs go numb.
Sit. Oh, you sit. You just bob around.
Good Lord.
Get in the pool. Get in the pool.
Kate Winslet told the LA Times, "The water was filthy, dirt blew into it, and actors splashing around in it got kidney infections. I only got to wear a wetsuit for a wide shot in the big tank where the water was about 60 degrees, and that felt absolutely freezing. Thankfully, they had rules for how long extras and performers would have to sit motionless in the water. The extras had been covered in wax on their clothes and hair to create a frozen effect. Their faces were doused with a powder that crystallized in water to look like frost, and they were given contact lenses that made them look like dead fish. Every few hours, these frozen blue corpses would suddenly become reanimated, stand up, and march off to take a break. There were warm water hoses and hot tubs nearby for actors to warm up. And Billy Zane told a great story to the New York Post. It paints a beautiful picture. The cast would sit in these hot tubs, fully dressed in their 1912 costumes, chowing down on craft services, saying, "You're noshing on a hot dog in a tux in a hot tub. Just deadpan, without any reaction, like this is completely normal." One of the on-set paramedics said that he was tasked with keeping an eye out for, quote, "violent shivering," in which case he was instructed to take those people out of the water right away, presumably to the chagrin of James Cameron. But other than emergencies and the pre-established breaks, people were not really allowed to leave the frozen wasteland of the pool, including for bathroom breaks. There's a persistent legend surrounding James Cameron dating back to his time filming The Abyss in the late 80s that he forbade those on the set from going to the bathroom. And it would appear that this tradition continued on the set of Titanic, supposedly due to the strict schedule he was forced to keep, and forced others to keep. In some version, he threatened to fire people on the spot if they dared to take a pee break. Cameron has denied this, presumably for legal reasons, but Kate Winslet has spoken several times over the years about her and Leo being forced to pee in the massive water tank. She said during an appearance on the Rosie O'Donnell show, "You know, when you gotta go, you gotta go. It was so awful because Leo sometimes would say to me, 'Sweetie, I gotta pee.' It was terrible. It was awful. And you always felt awful doing it. It took too long getting out with the wet clothes. I confess, it happened." The two of them would apparently pee in shifts, taking turns swimming over to another part of the tank. I've learned so much about Leonardo DiCaprio's bodily functions.
Yeah, no, that's true. No.
Fart jacket, designated pee spots, and James Cameron's human soup. Oi.
And from pissing in a pool, we naturally go to Kathy Bates. She played the beloved heroine of the Titanic story, the so-called unsinkable Molly Brown. Though, as we mentioned in the prior episode, no one called her Molly at the time. She went by Margaret. She and the other women in lifeboat number 6 took a very proactive role that night. The boat was overseen by one of Titanic's crew, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was the one who had his hand on the ship's wheel during the collision. Though it would be wrong to say that the collision was his fault, it's perhaps not a coincidence that he was in a bit of a pissy mood. Another man on the boat was Lookout Frederick Fleet, the man who first spotted the iceberg from the crow's nest. So, weird mood in that boat, I could imagine. Molly Brown, as depicted in the Titanic movie, wanted to go back to the wreck site and try to rescue people screaming in the water. Hitchens, the commander of the boat, refused, fearful that the boat would get swamped. And he delivered the immortal line, "There's no use going back. There's only a lot of stiffs out there. It's our lives now, not theirs." In the movie, Molly Brown backs down. In real life, Molly Brown overruled him. She went for the oars, and he tried to physically stop her. Molly then threatened to throw him overboard, and other women in the boat backed her up. And Hitchens, sensing a mutiny, backed down. He spent the rest of the night cussing her out to such a degree that one of the engine stokers who'd been rescued finally asked him, "Don't you know you're talking to a lady?" This poor guy, he really has a bad rap. He supposedly complained that the lifeboat was going to drift for days before any rescue came, which was not true. And at least 2 passengers in the boat publicly accused Hitchens of being drunk. But anyway, Molly Brown took command of the boat, passing out oars to other women and organizing the rowing. And after being rescued, she helped organize a committee with other wealthy passengers to provide basic services to second and third class survivors and even basic counseling, which I feel like is very advanced. So all in all, a pretty cool lady. Molly Brown's boat failed to recover any survivors. In fact, only 2 boats actually went back specifically to look for survivors, Boat 4 and Boat 14. In the movie, Rose is rescued by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who transferred survivors from his lifeboat into others in order to row back specifically to rescue people from the water. And he purposely waited a short time until the cries died down slightly so that his boat wouldn't get swamped, which is agonizing, but one of those choices one had to make that night, I suppose. That was a very real concern. But as his character says in the movie, he waited too long. In real life, he rescued just 4 men taken from the water, one of whom died later that night. I think the total of people plucked from the water who survived were 13. In the film, Officer Lowe wields a flashlight during his search for bodies, which is understandable because it's a movie and you need to be able to see what's happening. But in reality, this all unfolded in complete darkness. As the New York Times notes, much of the ending should have been a pitch black sequence. And though the first battery-powered flashlights were invented in 1899, these early versions were weak and unreliable, and as far as I'm aware, the only flashlight-adjacent tool that the survivors had in their lifeboats that night was a passenger's cane that had a tiny battery-powered light that was waved around to attract the attention of other lifeboats so they could stick together. And speaking of extremely granular points about illumination, This brings us to the stars. Years after the release of Titanic, James Cameron got what he described as, quote, quite a snarky email from astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, informing him that the star field that Rose sees as she gazes up from her improvised life raft was not the one she would have seen at that location in 1912. So Cameron, who, let's remember, basically rebuilt and sunk the Titanic and visited the real one 12 times, took this oversight hard. He said, with my reputation as a perfectionist, I should have known that, and I should have put the right star field in. So I said, all right, send me the right stars for that exact time, and I'll put it in the movie. And that's what he did. He reshot the scene for the 3D edition of the movie that was released in 2012.
Well, now we have arrived at what is without a doubt the most controversial section of this episode, and things are gonna get heated. It's time to talk about the so-called door controversy. Hashtag door controversy. Hashtag all doors matter. After the Titanic disappeared beneath them, Jack and Rose swim to a piece of wreckage commonly referred to in the discourse as a door. In fact, it is actually a piece of ornately carved wood paneling above the forward door in the first class lounge. You insects. It is actually a real piece of wreckage that was recovered after the sinking by one of the ships tasked with picking up bodies, and it is currently on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where you can see an original Titanic deck chair that was pulled from the ocean, as well as many other artifacts. Have you been there?
I've never been there, no.
We should go.
And we should, yeah.
Is that on the east or west side of Canada?
East.
Yeah, it. If you go to pay this piece of rose wreck wood a visit, be prepared. Like the Mona Lisa, it's actually a lot smaller in real life than James Cameron's version. You say about half the size.
Yeah, about half the size.
Cameron made it bigger because the original would never have been able to support the weight of a human being. But the real question that's on everybody's lips, could it have held Jack? Over the last 25 years, many Titanic fans have argued that there was room for both Rose and Jack on that piece of not a door. Instead, Jack did the gentlemanly thing and treaded water alongside the wreckage until dying. Frozenly. Wetly. Until wetly dying. The debate continues to rage. Leo was asked his thoughts about it by MTV News in 2019 during a junket for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, to which he wisely replied, no comment. Kate Winslet's opinion has flip-flopped over the years. Years back during an appearance on Jimmy Kimmel, she said, I think he actually could have fit on that bit of door. But more recently, she changed her tune, telling Josh Horowitz during an episode of the Happy, Sad, Confused podcast she didn't think it would work with two people. She likened it to two adults on a stand-up paddleboard. Oh, these coastal elites and their out-of-touch similes. Saying, it becomes immediately extremely unstable. I actually don't believe that we would have survived if we had both gotten on that door. I think he could have fit, but it would have tipped, and it would not have been a sustainable idea. And that gets closer to the truth. It is less a question of size and more of a question of buoyancy. Though there may have been room, it's doubtful that it would have stayed afloat. And this was the premise of a special 2012 episode of Mythbusters featuring James Cameron, who joked that it was a necessary plot point for Jack to die because if he lives, the movie makes a tenth as much. The script says Jack died. He has to die. So maybe we screwed up and the board should have been a little tiny bit smaller, but the dude's going down. The Mythbusters test concluded the only way they could have stayed afloat was if they'd tied Rose's life jacket underneath the board to help with its buoyancy. Otherwise, the weight of both their bodies would have sunk the board low enough in the freezing water that they both would have died. Another wild card here is the fact that Jack and Rose were trudging through the freezing water inside the ship for over an hour, so they probably would have lasted even less time in the ocean because their body temperature had already been lowered. In fact, some experts have said that they both would have died of hypothermia long before the ship even actually sank. James Cameron, as usual, has answers prepared for all of this. He told the Toronto Sun during press for the new Avatar movie that he had commissioned a scientific study, quote, to put this whole thing to rest and drive a stake through its heart once and for all. He continued, we have since done a thorough forensic analysis with a hypothermia expert who reproduced the raft from the movie, and we're going to do a little special on it that comes out in February.
Watch this space.
We took two stunt people who were the same body mass of Kate and Leo, and we put sensors all over and inside them? Question mark.
That's what it said.
And we put them in ice water, and we tested to see whether they could have survived through a variety of methods. And the answer was there was no way both of them could have survived. Only one could survive. This man needs to be stopped. This is what happens when you have too much money and power and self-confidence. He anally penetrate these people?
I don't know how he's got sensors inside. I think I'm more interested in like, hey, Kate, hey, Leo, what was your BMI back in 1997? Can you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Remember all that body shaming I did of you? Go back to that headspace. Kate, send me your set diary where I told you to weigh in every day. So, stay tuned to National Geographic, premiering in February. On to Alex's fan theory corner.
Yes.
There are fans who agree with James Cameron's quote, "If the script says Jack dies, he has to die." Also famously Dolph Lundgren's quote about Carl Weathers in Rocky 2, "If he dies, he dies." There's an internet theory positing that the film Titanic, not the boat Titanic, is set in the same universe as the Terminator movies, and Jack Dawson was a time traveler from the same future where Skynet has taken over the Earth and humanity is enslaved by robots. Or that's the Matrix. They're still fighting. They still have a fighting chance in Terminator. Similar to the Titanic plotline, in which Kyle Reese went back in time to protect Sarah Connor from a T-800 model Terminator, set up the birth of Resistance leader John Connor, which is he's his own granddad theory. Isn't that what they call that?
I think so.
It's like the Futurama plot where Fry is his own. I don't know. There's a whole time travel, man. I love my favorite bit of time travel explaining away is in Looper, where what's his name? Not French Stewart, the other one, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, is playing young Bruce Willis, and he's trying to prod Bruce Willis into explaining how the time travel works, and Bruce Willis says something like, "You think about it too much, it all gets fuzzy." It's the best hand wave away. Titanic Terminator theory states that Jack sacrificed himself to save Rose because that was his mission. He went back in time to protect Rose DeWitt Bukater. Why is her name so close to Bukaki? Who is another ancestor of John Connor, to prevent her suicide and ensure that she survived the sinking of the Titanic. Evidence cited by believers of this theory point to a number of anachronisms concerning Jack and his life story. For instance, when talking about his childhood, Jack claims to have grown up by Lake Wissota near Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Lake Wissota is a man-made lake that wasn't made until 1917, 5 years after the Titanic sank. Checkmate, James Cameron. Also, in the scene where he and Rose are discussing what they want to do when they get to America, Jack suggests going to the pier in Santa Monica where they can ride on the roller coaster until we throw up. Santa Monica's pier didn't acquire a roller coaster until 1916, 4 years after the Titanic sank. Checkmate, James Cameron. It has also been will not rest until we have bankrupted this man by pointing out every single historical anachronism in this film and forcing him to go back and do reshoots, ADR, VFX punches until he has no money left, and delaying the release of Avatar 6 Southie until 2046. It has also been noted by various vintage clothing experts that Jack's rucksack was of a style that wouldn't be manufactured until 1939.
You sound like you're cross-examining him.
By the Swiss Armor
your rucksack.
Prosecutor, Mr. Cameron, what do you have to say about that? This is James Cameron's gonna like regrettably, like he's gonna like tearfully have to kill the costume designer in the dead of night. Costume designer like wakes up in a cold sweat. James Cameron has like a silenced Walther PPK in a ski mask. And he goes, "You know what this is about, don't you?" And she goes, "It's the rucksack, isn't it?" He's like, "Yes." People on the internet. "I'm sorry, Mokushla." He shoots her. That is the Gaelic phrase meaning "my heart" that Clint Eastwood calls Hilary Swank in $1 Million Baby when he, spoiler alert, kills her. So if you're still traumatized by Jack's death, know that it was scientifically unavoidable, which will be proven in the months to come on National Geographic, #sponsored contact, #NatGeo, I don't know, do we get money for this? #iHeart Media ad sales. And 2, possibly preordained as part of a larger plan to save humanity against evil robots. The defense rests.
I think it's also worth noting that Jack and Rose have only known each other for just over 48 hours at this point. Jack stopped Rose committing suicide on Friday, April 12th, 1912, and the Titanic sank in the early hours of Monday, April 15th, 1912. So, safe to say maybe Rose got over it.
As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
There were a couple of interesting aspects about the end of this movie. As originally scripted, Cal was supposed to actually find Rose aboard the rescue ship the Carpathia the morning after the sinking. Rose tells him to let her mother know that she died on the Titanic and demands that Cal leave her alone the rest of her life. There was another scene with Cal that was cut where Fabrizio, Jack's Italian friend, is seen struggling in the water trying to climb aboard Cal's lifeboat, crying that it is his destiny to go to America. Cal then knocks him unconscious with a lifeboat oar and says, "America's that way."
You said that like a waspy man talking about his son's gay lover at a party. This is Fabrizio, my son's Italian friend.
I didn't know what to. I know. I'm Italian. I can say that. Predictably, James Cameron found this scene too dark and cut it. And there's still another scene that was storyboarded but never shot, in which Rose walks off the Carpathia, the rescue ship, in New York and disappears into the crowd. But in a rare concession to budgets, the scene was cut because it would have required almost 1,000 extras brought to New York to film a 30-second sequence. And they just didn't go along with it. Interestingly, Rose is seen arriving in New York on the Carpathia as it cruises past the Statue of Liberty, where she gives her name as Rose Dawson. It's a poignant moment, but it contains a minor historical error. In the movie, the statue is green, as it is now, but in reality, the statue retained its original brown color back in 1912. And, as you probably know,
checkmate, James Cameron.
The statue is made out of copper, and it took reportedly around 35 years for the elements to change it from brown to the green that we know today. It was unveiled in 1886, so it wasn't until the early 20s that it started to appear green. Here's a question. Why was it made out of a material that turned from a majestic copper to a sickly green hue? Was that some sort of prank by the French?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Did you want a real answer for that?
No, I mean, sure. If you got one. Like, why not something that doesn't turn green?
I don't know. Oh, wait. Actually, according to the New York Times in 2009, the green patina began gradually covering the surface of Liberty after 1900, was noted in the press at least as early as 1902, and it was entirely green by 1906.
Huh. Have I been bested by JC? I've seen both. I've seen.
Okay. I just wanted to flag. Just flagging.
Okay. Well, we'll
not
put
to
that
trigger
in.
you back
All
to.
right, we'll reach out to the statue's reps. After Jack dies, the movie more or less returns to the present. There are tears in the shipboard office where old Rose is telling her story to Bill Paxton's character, the treasure-hunting undersea explorer Brock Lovett, and his crew. The rest of the movie more or less belongs to Rose. Spoilers, I guess. You've listened to the 6-hour podcast. I'm assuming that you've probably seen this movie. We see Rose sneak out to the boat deck in the middle of the night, clutching the Heart of the Ocean necklace. Remember, that's the diamond that Bill Paxton's been looking for this whole time. Turns out she had it all along, having found it in her pocket when the Titanic survivors reached New York on the rescue ship Carpathia. And with a gleeful yelp, old Rose tosses the priceless jewel overboard. And there was an EW piece by Mary Solosi published for the 20th anniversary of Titanic in 2017 called 10 Other Titanic Baits We Should Be Having Besides the Door. And this piece explores the many reasons why Rose throws the priceless diamond overboard. She writes, was it symbolic of her letting go after having been explicitly told she never should? Or does the dropped diamond represent herself, Rose, joining her beloved Jack in the spot where he died a slow, cold, watery death decades prior? But is that notion undermined by the diamond's significance as a symbol of Cal's purchase of Rose? Did she keep it all those years just to look at it and laugh, thinking about how hard he must have searched for it? Did she keep it all those years planning to one day sail back to the spot where she lost the love of her life and almost died herself and just drop it? And honestly, was it really hers to throw away in the first place? It was a rather important historic artifact, and just abandoning it at the bottom of the North Atlantic is pretty irresponsible. And why didn't she sell it? That would have been sensible. Why didn't she donate it? That would have been selfless. Why did she drop it when that is neither sensible nor selfless? Lots to unpack with this one. I don't have an answer to this, but there was actually supposed to be another ending in which old Rose throws the diamond necklace overboard, but not before letting Bill Paxton's character hold the treasure. The scene starts with Paxton and old Rose's granddaughter, played by Susie Amos, who, as we've said several times, went on to marry James Cameron a few years later. They're basically flirting on the side of the ship when they see old Rose standing on the rung of the ship's railing. They run over in a panic, fearing that reliving the traumatic Titanic memories made her suicidal. And it's actually a sort of clever callback to the moment when Leo stops Rose from jumping off the back of the Titanic when they first met. Paxton approaches her and sees that she's holding the diamond that he's spent years and, frankly, countless millions of dollars searching for. And Rose dangles it in his face and dispenses vague truisms about how he's been looking for treasure in the wrong place and how only life is priceless, so we should make each day count, and basically just spoon-feeding the message of the movie to the audience. Bill Paxton's character makes a request to hold the diamond, which she allows, before flinging it into the ocean. The assembled crew screams, "Jesus, no!" as they run to the rail. Louis Abernathy, the goofy bearded guy, screams, "That really sucks, lady!" which is both a hilarious understatement and a hilarious thing to shout at an elderly woman. But Paxton's character Brock has an epiphany and just lets out a crazed laugh as the treasure begins its 2.5-mile plunge. All in all, this scene is bad. Bill Paxton was asked about the ending just a few weeks before his death in 2017, and he was pretty adamant that he wasn't a fan of this ending, telling Yahoo, "I would have shot heroin to make the scene work better." Pretty unambiguous. He continued, "I always saw the wraparound story that I was involved with Susie Amos and Gloria Stewart, who played Old Rose, like we were the gantry on the Saturn V rocket." He's recalling his role in Apollo 13, the gantry that holds up the rocket ship that launches Apollo 13 into space. "We were there to hold the rocket up, but once the rocket takes off, the gantry is forgotten and falls away. Coming back to us was a way to wrap it up and kind of tie up Old Rose's story and all that, but you didn't really need anything from us. Our job was done by then. So it became very evident in the cutting. If you're smart and you take the ego and narcissism out of it, you'll listen to the film. The film will tell you what it needs and what it does not. And the baby needs tough love. R.I.P. Bill Paxton." That ending would have been way too on the nose, which is why I appreciate the very end of the movie, which leaves room for ambiguity. Old Rose is in her bunk on the ship, surrounded by photos from her fabulous life, including rides on the Santa Monica Pier, just like Leo promised she would one day do. Then there's the fantasy sequence when she descends the ocean depths and reunites with Jack at the grand staircase, amid an ovation from the rest of the lost souls who perished in the disaster. And you'll notice that the clock behind Jack reads 2:20, which was the exact time that the ship foundered. For years, people have wondered whether Old Rose was just dreaming in her bunk or if she died. Like Jack said in the water, "You're going to die an old lady warm in your bed." And James Cameron has said that this ending was intentionally vague so that the audience could make up their own mind. And his screenplay is equally ambiguous. He writes, "We pan off the last picture to Rose herself, warm in her bunk. A profile shot. She's very still. She could be sleeping, or maybe something else." I love how he's coy in his own script. As we said in the previous episode, not even actress Gloria Stewart, who played Old Rose, knew for sure whether or not she was sleeping or dead when she filmed the scene. And she's only in the shot for a moment, so you can't tell if she's breathing or not. I checked. The filming schedule, as we mentioned earlier, was intended to last 135 days, but grew to 160. Shooting officially wrapped, I believe, on March 23rd, 1997, the day before my sister's 3rd birthday. James Cameron spent the summer of 1997 in an at-home editing room darkened by blackout curtains. By late July, he took a day off to marry Terminator star Linda Hamilton, his girlfriend of 7 years, in a backyard ceremony, and then the next day he went back to his editing suite and back to Titanic.
That's wild to me that his work on Avatar has lasted longer than several of his marriages.
Yeah. But not the Susie Amos. They're still together.
Nope, they are still together.
More than 20 years, yeah.
That one lasted. All right. God, I can't believe it took us this long to get to this.
Yeah.
There's one crucial component of Titanic not in place until extremely late in the game, and that is Celine Dion's ballad, My Heart Will Go On. James Cameron originally wanted Enya to compose the score to the film, and even went so far as to assemble a rough cut using her music, but she ultimately declined. Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries was apparently asked to both act in and compose music for the movie, but she also declined, reportedly due to the birth of her son. So, Cameron hired his one-time musical collaborator James Horner, who previously worked with him on Aliens. I believe James Horner did the Avatars. That movie, Aliens, was not a pleasant experience for Horner, as he experienced peak James Cameron, later saying, Aliens was James' first big film, and he wanted every frame and note to be perfect. But I had just 10 days to write the music, and there was a lot of friction between us. I didn't think we'd ever work together again. But Horner read the script and loved it. Cameron heard his Braveheart soundtrack and loved it. So the seeds were re-sown. James Horner is, as we touched on in the Hocus Pocus episode, somewhat of a controversial Hollywood composer. He has been accused of reusing his own previously written works, or were existing works by classical composers. In a 1997 issue of Film Score Monthly, an editorial review of Titanic said Horner was, quote, skilled in the adaptation of existing music into films with just enough variation to avoid legal troubles. This is not strictly true. Horner got in trouble for his work on 1989's Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the main theme of which incorporates cues from the score to Federico Fellini's 1973 film Amarcord by Nino Rota, and Raymond Scott's piece Powerhouse, regularly heard in Looney Tunes. If you're going to steal from another composer, maybe don't make it one of the most common Looney Tunes musical cues, you putz. This led Raymond Scott's estate to threaten a lawsuit against Disney, who paid an undisclosed settlement out of court. Oh, I shouldn't have called him a putz. He died. However, history has taken a kinder view of him following the mega success of Titanic, not to mention his death in a single-occupant plane crash in the Los Padres National Forest in 2015. I forgot that he died. Back to Titanic. James Cameron invited James Horner over and screamed at him for hours. Like he did to an ailing Stanley Kubrick. At the iconic director's home.
That he invited himself over to.
Cameron invited Horner over and screened 36 hours of footage for him. Horner supposedly wrote the main themes for the movie in one night, heavily influenced by Irish folk music, paying tribute to the ship's Irish heritage. Titanic had been built in Belfast in Northern Ireland, stopped at Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland as its final port of call, and there were many Irish immigrants on board. It wasn't long before James Horner remembered that James Cameron was a nightmare to work with, though. He told Entertainment Weekly in 1998, we'd lock the movie, then release dates would shift, and Jim would fine-tune it, so I'd fine-tune. Then we'd lock it, and the dates would shift again, and he'd fine-tune, and I'd say, God, I'm going to have to do this cue 600 times. The other problem with the closing credits. Given all the people who worked on this 3-hour epic, the credits were long, something like 8 minutes. And this was an issue for James Horner, who later said, my job is to keep the audience in their seats and not let them off the hook. It's my personal belief I should never let anyone put their coats on. Okay. They have to be in it as long as they can be. As I started writing this 8-minute sequence, I was saying, how am I going to do this? Just another orchestra reprise? It had to be very intimate, very emotional. His solution was to have a full-fledged song but Cameron was dead set, in Horner's words, against a love song over the closing credits. He felt strongly that he only wanted instrumentals for the soundtrack, believing that a pop song would seem a bit tone deaf. He compared it to commissioning a pop single for the soundtrack to Schindler's List. Never one for a subtle simile. Horner later told Empire magazine, James did not want it to be a Hollywood movie that had violins soaring away around it and a song pasted in at the end. Which, as you put in narrator voice, was what he got. So, Horner furtively recruited lyricist Will Jennings to put words to Titanic's main instrumental theme. And then he called in a favor from his friend Celine Dion of the Canadian Dions. Oh, Will Jennings wrote the lyrics to Tears in Heaven.
Oh, wow.
Wow, he was very,
Prolific gentleman.
Oh, he wrote lyrics to Higher Love by Steve Winwood?
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Higher Love bangs. Looks Like We Made It by Barry Manilow. Up Where We Belong by Officer and a Gentleman. Wow.
Oh, wow.
Will Jennings.
I'll Never
killing
Love
it.
This Way Again by Dionne Warwick.
Yeah.
Didn't we almost have it all? Whitney Houston? Wow.
God, being a lyricist must be just God, what a job, man. You come in, somebody's already done the hard work, and you just spout a bunch of horse cliches over it and get half the money. Anyway, if anyone wants me to write lyrics to your James Cameron score, he called in a favor from his friend Celine Dion to record a vocal demo in the spring of 1997, later telling Billboard, she started singing the song and it was just electrifying. By the end of it, we were all emotionally shook up. She started crying while singing it 2/3 of the way through the song, and then everybody in the room was crying. She was singing it like her life depended on it. At one point, she had to stop singing and compose herself, but she reportedly nailed it in a single take. Though it was supposed to be a demo, the emotion in the tune was so perfect that it ended up being the master take heard on the soundtrack. But Horner waited for the right time to present the song to James Cameron. He wanted Cameron to be at a point where he was, quote, comfortable with the film. As Horner recalled in Empire magazine, the day finally came when I played it for him. He played it for his family, who loved it, but he was still not convinced. James Cameron's like, son and children are like, Dad, we really love these songs. He's like, what do you know?
Wait, we have to mention that the song was produced by Walter Afanasieff, the co-writer of All I Want for Christmas Is You.
And targeted victim of Mariah Carey's concerted attempt to write him out of that song. Horner said it took him, Cameron, another month and a half to be convinced. We took it to New York and previewed the song, and the audience was in tears and tatters at the end. That's when he decided the song would be in the movie, and when he realized it was a cinematic tool and not a gimmick. He had to see it with an audience to believe that.
Wait, you mean I can hurt people with this emotionally? Oh, great. Okay.
Cut. Print. James Cameron to a crying Celine Dion. Can we go again? There's also a good chance that Cameron wanted to appease anxious studio executives who would have appreciated the added bonus of a hit song. And James had a lot of anxious executives on his ass.
Yes, cost overruns and extended shooting schedules made a lot of people at Paramount and Fox extremely nervous. Early projected costs for Titanic were $75 million. Paramount and 20th Century then joined forces to pony up $110 million and wanted it ready by July 1997. But costs had ballooned to $200 million, or in other words, 22 times the cost of the original ship, making it the most expensive film ever made. And making matters worse, it wasn't ready until December 1997, 5 months later. Typical filming schedules can run anywhere from 30 to 90 days, depending on the scope or complexity of a film. The original schedule for Titanic, I've seen it was either 135 or 138 days of principal photography. In the end, it took an extra 22 days to finish up, or about 15% longer than expected. And remember, this was a love story with a sad ending, not a superhero movie that was certain to score big at the box office. In other words, it was kind of a bummer. Plus, it was long, 3 hours and 14 minutes, or sometimes 15. In either case, much longer than your standard popcorn flick. When studio heads insisted on trimming it so that theaters could fit in more screenings per day and make more money, Cameron reportedly responded by telling the head of Fox, Bill Mechanic, who visited him on the set at 2 a.m, if you want to cut my film, you'll have to fire me. And to fire me, you'll have to kill me. Then Cameron stormed off the set.
Why did he make that threat so much?
I don't know.
You'll have to kill me.
Because it's effective. Maybe he's a big Cool Hand Luke fan. I don't know.
You can have my large boat when you pry it from my cold dead hands.
But Cameron knew he had the studio over a barrel because he knew that they knew he was the only person on the planet who could manage this production and put all the pieces together. So they kind of had to do what he said. As you can probably guess, Cameron had very little patience for any studio brass he felt weren't supporting him. Bill Mechanic likened it to, quote, being in the trenches and your infantryman is shooting at you, even if you're the only one there who can save his life. Even though he knew I was on his side, nobody's ever on his side.
I want a listicle. I want a BuzzFeed listicle of James Cameron's drastically inappropriate similes ranked.
Oh, here, tell this next one then.
Well, yeah. While we're on that, Cameron told a producer to deliver the following message to a top executive at Fox. Tell your friend he's getting in the ass, and if he would stop squirming, it wouldn't hurt so much.
God.
Oh, what an asshole. But he gets results.
Now, in 1996, shooting a typical action blockbuster like Batman Forever or the Bond movie Tomorrow Never Dies costs an average of $100,000, maybe $150,000 a day. Titanic averaged between $225,000 and $300,000 a day, and this was after construction ended on the brand new 40-acre movie studio that Cameron had built to film it, which cost something like $23 million. Speaking to the LA Times, Cameron's first assistant director had this to say of the film's $200 million budget. It was just too big. I've been doing this for over 12 years, and I still can't get over the size of this. There should be a law against making movies over $180 million. Jesus, you could make 18 Woody Allen movies for that. How many Sling Blades could you make? About 40? $180 million is the budget for education in the state of who knows where. I find that obscene. Echoing Kate Winslet's sentiment there. I love this story too. At one point, the studio sent a producer named Marty Katz to try to get the spending under control. Katz, aware that this was a very sensitive situation, asked Cameron to consider him a friend. Cameron responded, "Friends? Friends? I don't need friends. You're not my friend." Katz countered, "I'm the only friend this production has at the studio. We're in trouble. They don't know when the bleeding's going to stop." And Katz picks up the story. He looks at me with a twinkle in his eye and says, "Friend of the picture is good, but by the way, our little conversation here just cost $150,000. And with that, Cameron turned around and went back to work. But I think my favorite story of nervous execs is when they made the first teaser trailer. The film was so behind schedule that none of the special effects were ready, so the best they could do was have a short clip of old Rose narrating about the necklace. This was so underwhelming that one Fox executive vomited over his own shoes after screening it. Now, at one point, James Cameron ran into Fox CEO Rupert Murdoch and told him, "I guess I'm not your favorite person in the world, but the movie is going to be good." And Murdoch replied, "It better be a damn sight better than just good." And there's another great Murdoch story that we discussed during our Air Force One episode a long time ago. Rupert Murdoch demanded to see an early cut of Titanic just to see where all his money was going. And apparently they delivered a faulty, defective print to Rupert Murdoch's private screening room. I'm theorizing that this might have been on purpose because James Cameron either wasn't ready to show it or just didn't want any meddling from anyone. But in any case, Rupert Murdoch instead watched, of all things, an advanced cut of another 20th Century Fox movie, I think, Air Force One. And Murdoch loved it. In fact, he loved it so much that when he finally saw a completed cut of Titanic, the first thing he said was, "It's good, but it's no Air Force One." Can you imagine how galling that must have been for James Cameron? I love that so much.
I like to think about it every day when I wake. All in all, executives feared the movie would be as big a disaster, pregnant pause, as the Titanic itself. Things got so bad that Cameron forfeited his $8 million director salary and percentage of the gross as a token of confidence to try and allay budget concerns at the studio as a good faith measure. As he told Howard Stern, "We told them $120 million, and that's what we thought it was going to cost. That's why I wound up giving them back all my money, because I said, guys, I don't want you to think we lied to you just so we could get you to make this movie." The studio was so worried about all the money that they'd sunk into Titanic that they also demanded profit participation points on his next movie too. Upon hearing this, Cameron says he told the head of Fox, You may yourself. Do you think he meant that you might yourself because my movie will flop, or you may yourself as in I cordially invite you to go yourself?
Yes, I think the latter. Yes.
Okay. What was his next movie after? Was it Avatar?
Yeah.
Jesus. It seemed like a mathematical impossibility to make back the studio's money. As shipbuilder Thomas Andrews says in the film, she will sink. It is a mathematical certainty. Fox calculated that even if Titanic outperformed the most successful 3-hour movie in memory, Dances with Wolves, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1990, the studio would still lose $70 million. To be a success, Titanic needed to repeat its 28 million opening weekend ticket sales and stay the number one movie in America for many, 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 many weeks in a row, in a way no movie had in nearly a decade. Narrator voice, it would. He would say later that in the 6-month lead up to the release, he was certain that they were about to lose $100 million. He told EW, "We wrapped in early March, 97, and the next few months were rough because we were getting heavily shelled by the press that thought we were the biggest idiots in the history of Hollywood. Titanic was going to be the next Waterworld. The film studios had me utterly convinced that there was no conceivable way that the film would be profitable, so the only thing I had left to cling to was that we would make a quality movie." But even that was in doubt. He admitted at the time that while he feared Titanic would be all things to everyone or nothing to anybody, not enough action for the action crowd, not enough romance for the romance crowd, a chocolate-covered cheeseburger, okay. As he edited, he had a razor blade taped onto the screen, which the note saying, "Use in case the film sucks." And to clarify, he did not mean to edit the film. As he said, when everybody doubts you, it's hard not to doubt yourself. But I was looking at the footage saying, guys, I'm seeing a good movie here. An early version was about 35, 40 minutes longer, but he said that it was, quote, soggy and too long. Yes, James, it was 4 hours. Too many
in
stories.
water.
I made some draconian decisions and chopped out a subplot that ultimately transformed the film, which you speculate is the romantic subplot between Bill Paxton's character and Rose's granddaughter.
That's my guess, yeah.
Makes sense.
Cameron also had problems coming from outside the studio as well. All the horror stories from the set of Titanic, not to mention the delays, had resulted in some seriously bad press. As a result, from the very start, the critics were out for blood, slamming the movie in the press for a full year before it even come out. Stories of Cameron's dictatorial attitudes on the set meant that a decent amount of the trashing was directed at him personally. He later said in an op-ed in The Hollywood Reporter, "We were being pummeled relentlessly in the press, especially in the industry trade papers, about epic cost overruns, set safety, delivery dates, and just about everything. We were the biggest morons in Hollywood history, and the press had the long knives out, sharpening them as we approached our release. Critics said it was a bloated leviathan, a behemoth, and a tiresome epic that, according to Washington Post's Desson Howell, left viewers, quote, thinking that unpardonable thought, okay, sink already." Cameron, as he's wont to do, did not take this lying down and fought back by giving numerous interviews, writing letters to print media, and even taking out ads in the trade press to present his side of the story. And he especially went hard for LA Times critic Kenneth Turin, who, to be fair, had come hard for him first with a particularly scathing review. He writes, "Just as the hubris of headstrong shipbuilders who insisted that the Titanic was unsinkable led to an unparalleled maritime disaster, so Cameron's overweening pride has come unnecessarily close to capsizing this project, calling it a hackneyed, completely derivative copy of old Hollywood romances." And then he would go on to slam the Titanic in 3 subsequent interviews.
How many reviews do you need to... Well, whatever.
When you're 3 hours and 15 minutes in the biggest movie in the country and in theaters for like 9 months. Probably a lot of the additional ones were like, wait, why are people still going to see this movie? I said it was bad. Listen to me.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Talk about like grasping in your own obsolescence.
James Cameron responded in characteristic fashion with a 1,200-word open letter to the Times, which featured the memorable line, "Forget about Clinton. How do we impeach Kenneth Turin?" He added, "Poor Kenny. He sees himself as the lone voice crying in the wilderness, righteous but not heeded by the blind and dumb great unwashed around him. It must be a great burden to be cursed with such clear vision when your misguided flock bray past you like lemmings unmindful." I mean, basically what we just said, but so much more savage. This beef became a national news story, and years later, Cameron remained pissed off by the incident, saying, "What bothered me was that somehow he decided to vilify Titanic as an example of everything wrong in Hollywood." I can't. This is so gross. I'm paraphrasing this.
Read it. Look into my eyes as you read it.
This phrase grosses me to my core. "Excuse me, you can't take the one film that had the hair on its balls, ew, to go out and be 3 hours long and be a mainstream picture that didn't kowtow to every so-called piece of mainstream knowledge of what you have to do to survive, that involved itself in things that every studio executive in town would have run screaming from, and say that it's emblematic of everything that's wrong in Hollywood, and do it over and over. You just can't do that. There's one newspaper in this city that sits on the breakfast table of everyone I work with." The LA Times. "You're attacking me in my house." And Cameron added in one particularly revealing quote, "I'm going to fight back. It's that simple. If you did it tomorrow, I'd do the same thing. I'm a crusty Canadian farmer at heart. You come onto our land, we put some buckshot in your ass."
Disturbingly close to saying we'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way.
Well, Titanic had its premiere at the Tokyo Film Festival in November 1997, where police were needed to control the thousands of hysterical girls surrounding the theater. One screamed, "Leo, I'm ready to die for you." I guess she was a Romeo and Juliet fan. This boded well for the wide release on December 19th, 1997. This sounds like a joke, but it was just a modest success at first, barely winning its opening weekend with a $28.6 million take. But then it just didn't stop. It was a marathon, not a sprint. The highest single grossing day was in its 60th day of release, Valentine's Day appropriately enough, which just that doesn't happen. You don't have your biggest day 2 months into a film's release. Cameron said that they learned in late January, about a month and a half after the film was released, that it was going to break even. And he said that was the day that he popped champagne. Because, he said, that had always seemed like an unattainable goal. He never thought it would break even. People not only told their friends to see this movie, but they went to see it over and over again themselves. The normal repeat viewing rate for a blockbuster theatrical film is between 2 and 5%. The repeat rate for Titanic was 20%. A month after the release, Fox estimated somehow, I don't know how they got this figure, that 7% of teenage girls had seen it twice. In March of 1998, the Associated Press ran a cute story about a 12-year-old Italian girl named Gloria who'd gone to see Titanic at the only movie theater in her small town every single night of its release and planned to until it left the theaters. At the time of the report, she had seen it 50 times and still wasn't tired of it. The theater no longer charged her admission and even saved her favorite seat for her every night.
Aw.
Heigl, tell us about the money. Enough of all these cute stories of adolescent love. Tell us about the cold, filthy lucre.
Titanic held, and probably until Avatar 2: The Way of Water, holds the record for longest theatrical run, staying in theaters for nearly 10 months.
That's nuts.
It was still in theaters when it came out on VHS on September 1st, 1998. Screenings of the movie were so popular that Paramount had to send replacement film reels out to theaters when the originals wore out. Titanic was the top grossing film for 16 consecutive weeks and became the first film to gross over $1 billion. Kate and Leo were apparently so green that they didn't know this was a big deal, with Leo saying, $1 billion? So that's good?
I thought maybe he was being sarcastic. I don't know. It just because even a newbie seems, anything with billion with a B is good.
I mean, he might be kind of an idiot.
No, perhaps.
Remember the fart thing?
Oh, yeah.
The box office receipts were even more impressive considering the 3-hour film could only be shown 3 times a day instead of the usual 4. It became the highest grossing movie in U.S. history, shattering the record that had been held by Star Wars: A New Hope, which crushed 10-year-old me, as I mentioned.
I know.
George Lucas took out an ad in Variety where Han and Leia posed like Jack and Rose as a public congratulations to James Cameron, which was magnanimous of him.
Yeah.
Something James Cameron would never, ever do. Just imagining James Cameron taking out a full-page ad in Variety that has like one of the Na'vi like pushing Jack into the water when Avatar, just to spite himself and his own movie. It was the
Kicking him
highest
off the
grossing.
board, off the door.
Yeah. It was the highest grossing film of all time from 1998 until 2010, when James Cameron surpassed it with his own film, his next film, Avatar. Now Titanic sits at the number 3 spot on the list with $2.1 billion. Avatar is still number 1, 2.7 bill, and Avengers Endgame is number 2. And Jordan, we can't forget Celine Dion.
We can't. We saw what happened when Rolling Stone did on their best singers list. They got picketers, so we cannot forget Celine Dion. The soundtrack song My Heart Will Go On debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart on February 28th, 1998, and sent the Titanic soundtrack into a 16-week run at number 1, an unprecedented feat for a largely orchestral soundtrack album. The song also went on to win Best Original Song at the Oscars in 1998, where Celine Dion performed wearing a $1.4 million recreation of the Heart of the Ocean necklace that Asprey and Garrard were commissioned to create. It is a 171-carat heart-shaped Ceylon sapphire surrounded by 103 diamonds. It was auctioned off for charity to benefit the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund and Southern California's Aid for AIDS Foundation, and has reportedly not been made available for public viewing ever since. The soundtrack recording became the best-selling instrumental movie soundtrack of all time, and for several weeks, the book about the making of the Titanic film was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, the first time that such a tie-in book had achieved this status. All in all, it was a bona fide phenomenon. Titanic was nominated for 14 Academy Awards, tying the record set by All About Eve in 1950. Hilariously, the movie had been nominated in almost every category except screenplay, which we had talked about in the first episode of this trilogy. Wasn't great. And Best Actor. Leonardo DiCaprio got passed over, and it's perhaps not a coincidence that he was a no-show at the Oscar ceremony in March of 1998. To quote Michael Jordan, Cameron took this personally. I don't think Michael Jordan said that in that documentary, but the meme said that. He said that. James Cameron told Rolling Stone, I felt it was kind of a snub, not of the film per se, but of all the other people who did care and had sweated blood for the movie. So I kept calling and saying, you got to go to the Oscars for the team. And frankly, you have to go for yourself, because the consequences of not going will be that you're going to look like a spoiled punk. So he didn't go, and he looked like a spoiled punk. And Leo knows that I feel that way, so I'm not saying anything out of school. He agonized over it, but there was something about it that just wasn't him. That was the message I got on my machine like the day before. Just ain't me, bro. Apparently getting $4 million to do a juice ad that airs only in Japan is him, but going to the Oscars is not. Again, James Cameron with the body shots there. Wow. Kate Winslet got a Best Actress nomination, which was the least they could do considering all she went through. And 87-year-old Gloria Stewart, aka Old Rose, was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, becoming the oldest person ever nominated for an Oscar at the time, a record she held for 19 years until 2018 when Christopher Plummer was nominated for Best Supporting Actor at age 88, I think for All the Money in the World is the movie. Stewart, however, still holds the record for the oldest woman nominated for Best Supporting. In addition, Titanic was the first film to have 2 cast members, Winslet and Stewart, nominated for playing the same role. I wonder if Marlon Brando, I guess it was a different movie. I guess it was Godfather 1 and 2. I was going to say Brando and De Niro.
I guess that's the caveat, that it was in 2 different movies.
Yeah. Sadly, they both lost in their respective categories. Kate Winslet to Helen Hunt in As Good as It Gets, and Gloria Stewart to Kim Basinger in LA Confidential. A favorite of our friend Craig, friend of the pod, Craig, who thinks that Titanic robbed LA Confidential of a Best Picture win, which,
Go
sure.
on. Say something controversial, yet brave.
No. 6 hours in, no. I'm committing to this bit. Kate Winslet would win an Oscar for The Reader in 2009, but sadly Gloria Stewart would not. But at least she got a cameo in Britney Spears' Oops, I Did It Again video, so worthy consolation all around. Despite these losses, Titanic won 11 Oscars during the ceremony on March 23rd, 1998, tying the record previously set by Ben-Hur in 1959. Wow, I think the ceremony was a year to the day after the film wrapped. I like that. And I think that they broke ground on the studio that they built specifically to film it on some anniversary of work being begun on the original Titanic. I like that. I guess there are only so many days in the year, and this went on for so long that you're bound to have stuff line up. But still, I like that. Titanic was the first movie to win all 7 technical categories. That it deserves: cinematography, editing, production design, costume design, sound mixing, sound editing, and visual effects. And it was also the first Best Picture winner to be produced, directed, written, and edited by the same person, James Cameron. It was also the first movie to win both the Academy Award and the MTV Movie Award for Best Picture. Yeah. I mean, again, it just shows that it appealed to everybody. And it was also the only film to win both the Academy Award for Best Picture and Nickelodeon's Kids' Choice Award for Favorite Movie. Again, appealed to everybody. Stodgy film people loved it. Teenagers and Gen Xers loved it. Little baby millennials like us loved it. Everybody loved Titanic. James Cameron famously ended his Oscar speech for Best Director by shouting the line he'd ad-libbed one day on the Titanic set, "I'm king of the world." To me, this seems like a gimme, which is a perfect reference for this triumphant moment. But apparently this resulted in even more bad press for James Cameron. I don't remember this at all, but apparently he was mocked repeatedly. He later said, "After jumping up and making a fool of myself with my acceptance speech for Titanic, I'm sure nobody wants to see me at the Academy Awards again. Or maybe they want me to win again to see if I can make an even bigger fool of myself." In keeping with the theme with James Cameron, bigger is better. But I am sure he got over it. He went home with 3 Oscar statues that night: Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Film Editing. "I haven't figured out what to do with them yet," he said soon after. "I thought of drilling a hole through the head of one and wearing it on a chain around my neck." And honestly, I'm shocked by his restraint that he didn't do this. His journey that began over a decade earlier watching the 1987 National Geographic documentary about the discovery of the Titanic was now over. It had cost $200 million and an untold amount of human suffering, but he had made Large Boat. And as such, we have made our Large Boat trilogy. After all of this, there's really only one thing to say. In 2017, Titanic was selected for preservation by the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally and historically and aesthetically significant.
Boom.
If that's not the perfect ending for this, well, damn it, I don't know what is. As we said earlier, it took James Cameron something like 160 shooting days to make Titanic, and in a nod to his obsession with historical accuracy, I had intended to spend 160 days making this episode, but Heigl reported me to iHeart's HR. So you'll have to be satisfied with the fact that this trilogy was twice as long as the actual movie. But 3 episodes, 6-ish hours, and 72 pages of notes later, I think I am finally out of stuff to say about Titanic. And frankly, I feel like the king of the world. Heigl, what about you?
I don't know if my heart will go on, but my voice loss will.
Yeah.
He croaked hoarsely. No, I was trying to for heart. My heart will go on, and it turned out as the Hobbit theme. Folks, thank you for listening. This has been Large Boat
Part 3, Large Harder.
We got to do a lightning round of just like proposed Titanic sequels.
I want to see like what led Cal to off himself.
The gritty character, like a prequel. Titanic. Yeah, they do a preboot of Titanic. It's just called Cal. It's just like a slow, ominous piano music in the background, like dun dun. He thought he was in love, but there was something between them.
Is that a play on the poster slogan? Nothing on earth could come between them. It was on all the posters.
Just crudely photoshopping Billy Zane in there. You know what I really want is like a marriage story, like Noah Baumbach, like quiet, slow burn, John Cheever-esque, like dull, mid-century ennui of the suburbs. Franny and Zoe, gifted child, Royal Tenenbaums, like Rose survives and marries the dullest man on earth, and then we just get like a long, like 3 cuts in the entire movie. It's 4 hours. It's My Dinner with Andre, but it's just Rose's sad upper class life.
We don't know anything about her husband.
No.
Oh.
No. Constantly, he will be played by John C. Reilly. Constantly flashing back to Jack.
In full on like Mr. Cellophane in Chicago mode, like just complete non-person.
I hope so. Or alternate take, it's an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge situation, and we get, or like a Last Temptation of Christ situation where we get a whole movie where Jack, like it's like they survive happily, and it's like a Revolution Road, or like Douglas Sirk, like 50s women melodrama, and then at the end of it, we just smash cut to her drowning. And the whole thing was an elaborate fantasy right before she died. That's my pitch for a Titanic movie. Directed by Terrence Malick.
Ooh. That's pretty good.
Another Titanic pitch.
She's just looking at a snow globe with a ship in it. That worked better than I thought.
Yeah, actually. What about did any of the dogs survive? Do we do like a Milo and Otis, like the incredible Homeward Bound, like a dog focused Titanic movie where it's just a dog, or Life of Pi? We do like a Life of Pi where it's like a dog in a lifeboat and the dog really wants to eat, let's say, a child, and it's just the two of them in a lifeboat and they learn life lessons to each other. The dog is played by John C. Reilly. The child is played by Robert De Niro, digitally de-aged. Oh man, yeah. What if we get? Oh, we didn't even talk about. We could do a prequel to Jack or to Titanic, just called Jack, and it's footage from the Robin Williams movie.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
With his face
in his treehouse, crudely Cosby,
crudely pasted over, crudely photoshopped over DiCaprio. No, it's called Jack, and it's a horror movie. And he's Jack the Ripper. Oh my God, we've cracked it. It's a gripping psychological horror movie, directed but period accurate, directed by Robert Eggers, showing what happened before Jack got on the Titanic. He was Jack the Ripper.
He's skipping town.
They
were on his
exactly.
tail.
There are rumors that Jack the Ripper was an American. I don't know that those are actually true. I'm saying them, so yes, but yeah. He was Jack the Ripper. He had to get out of town. And so we're going to get the whole Whitechapel murders. It's going to be historically accurate. They're going to digitally de-age Leonardo DiCaprio down. And Robert Eggers will actually have him sharpen his own knives and construct his own Victorian hovel to live in. And then the whole movie will end up with him winning the tickets in the game.
That's really good. No. The movie ends with "I'm the king of the world." Completely inverting the whole emotion of that scene.
All of these movies,
of a sudden, it's like instead of just like, oh, we're joyful for this like vagabond who's
we're seeing the grim. Now we're seeing the grim triumph of a serial killer who got away with it. You know what they would do for the trailer then would be a slowed down, sinister version of the Who's Happy Jack. So slowed plus reverb. Happy Jack.
Kind of sounds like an Irish folk song, yeah.
Boom. Was a boom, boom, boom. He's like, I didn't always go by Jack. I used to go by the Ripper. Or so I don't know. What's a nickname? What's the long name for Jack? Is it Jackathan? They used to call me Jackathan when I was in Whitechapel. Happy Jack. Dun, dun, dun. Gold. Oh God, why don't they pay us more for this?
I hope you're rolling.
I am. We're into bonus material at this point. This is we're just going to put out a supplementary episode. This is Jordan and I developing the plot of the Titanic sequels and reboots, and all of it is trademarked. All of you owe me money. All right. This has been Large Boat. Too much information. Large boat. Boat harder. Sink harder. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time. Too Much Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl,
with original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.